Welcome, welcome. You're here at Supreme Harry. Today we present to you, what if Fawkes appeared during sorting and burned 34 blocks on Harry's core screaming Dumbledore's name to entire hall. Like and subscribe if you want more awesome stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Chapter 1, The Burning. The sorting hat smelled like old leather and something else, something Harry couldn't name, like the inside of a fireplace that hadn't been used in a very long time but still held heat in its stones. He'd been sitting on the stool for what felt like 3 minutes, which was already longer than anyone else, and the entire great hall had gone from politely curious to actively, uncomfortably attentive. Interesting, the hat murmured in his ear, low enough that only he could hear. Very interesting indeed. I haven't felt anything quite like, well. That's a complication. What's a complication? Harry whispered through barely moving lips. You are, boy. Quite spectacularly so. Around him, the candlelight floated in its usual golden columns above 4 long tables packed with students who had all stopped eating, drinking, and whispering in favor of staring. Harry could feel their attention like a physical pressure on the back of his neck. He'd spent 10 years being stared at by people who thought he was a freak, so he knew the particular quality of that silence, the kind where everyone was waiting to see what kind of strange thing would happen next. He'd gotten very good at sitting inside that silence without flinching. You've got courage, the hat continued, sounding almost conversational. That's obvious. But there's something underneath it. Something I'm not. Hang on. A pause. When did you last use magic intentionally? On the train, Harry murmured. Lumos. Hermione showed me. No. I don't mean with a wand. Another pause, longer this time, and Harry had the distinct impression that the hat was pressing at something it couldn't quite get purchase on, like someone trying to pry open a locked door with their fingernails. There's a structure here that isn't built the way cores are built. It's more like, it was built and then something was built on top of it and then something was built on top of that. Is something wrong? Harry asked. I genuinely don't know, the hat said, and it sounded honest in a way that was not remotely reassuring. You'd best go to Gryffindor. Gryffindor, it bellowed. The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry pulled the hat off his head, handed it back to Professor McGonagall, who had gone slightly rigid in a way he'd learned to recognize as her version of alarm, and walked toward the red and gold table with his chin up and his heart hammering in a way he refused to show on his face. He'd just sat down, a red-haired boy named Ron dropping into the seat beside him and grinning, when the temperature in the great hall changed. It wasn't a dramatic shift. It wasn't cold, exactly, or warm. It was more like the air itself suddenly became attentive, the way a room feels when someone very important walks in, except that no door had opened. The enchanted ceiling, which had been faithfully projecting a clear September sky full of stars, flickered. Not like a malfunction. Like a blink. Then something landed on the stool at the front of the hall. It hadn't flown in through a window. It hadn't appeared with the crack of apparition. One moment the stool was empty, the 3-legged thing holding nothing but the sorting hat which had been returned to it, and the next moment a bird was sitting on the back of it, perched on the top rail with its long tail hanging down like a burning curtain, and everyone in the great hall, from the first-year students still waiting to be sorted to the professors at the high table to the hundreds of portraits lining the walls, went completely and totally silent. Harry had never seen a phoenix before. He knew what it was the moment he saw it, the same way you know the ocean the first time you see it even if no one's ever described it to you. It was enormous, much larger than he'd expected, its plumage not the uniform red and gold of the illustrations in the books he'd read on the Hogwarts Express but something more complex, deeper, shot through with colors that shouldn't exist at the same time, ember red and ash white and a gold so deep it was almost amber and then, at the edges of each feather, a blue-black that was the color of a fire when it burns its hottest. Its eyes were the problem. They were intelligent in a way that went past the intelligence you attributed to clever animals, past even the intelligence you'd give to something like a talking portrait. The phoenix looked at the hall the way Harry imagined a very old person might look at something they'd watched go wrong for a very long time and had finally decided they were done being patient about. Then it looked at Harry. The students at the Gryffindor table physically leaned away. Not all of them consciously, most of them didn't even realize they'd done it, but the space around Harry cleared by about 8 inches in every direction in the span of a second as the Phoenix fixed him with those burning eyes and held his gaze. Harry didn't look away. He'd learned, a long time ago in the cupboard under the stairs, that looking away was the thing that made it worse. "Is that," Ron started, very quietly. "Fawkes," said a girl 2 seats down, lavender brown, and her voice came out barely above a whisper. "That's Fawkes. That's Dumbledore's Phoenix." "What's Dumbledore's Phoenix doing here?" someone else hissed. Nobody had an answer. At the high table, Professor McGonagall had taken 2 steps forward and then stopped, as if uncertain whether moving closer was a good idea. Professor Quirrell had gone the color of old chalk. The other professors ranged from alert to openly alarmed, and the one empty chair, the largest one, at the center, remained conspicuously empty. Dumbledore was not in the hall. Fawkes opened his beak. What came out was not a song. Not exactly. Phoenix song, from everything Harry would later read about it, was supposed to be beautiful in a way that made you feel simultaneously brave and grief-stricken, a kind of emotional weather you couldn't protect yourself from. This wasn't that. This was a single note, sharp and enormous, like someone had struck the largest bell in existence with a hammer and let it ring inside an enclosed space, and layered inside the note, if you listened hard enough, were 2 syllables. Dumbledore. The name hit the stone walls and came back from 6 directions at once. Several people clapped their hands over their ears. The enchanted candles above all 4 tables flared simultaneously and then guttered, as if the sound had physically disturbed them. 2 second years at the Ravenclaw table knocked their goblets over. A portrait of a medieval witch near the door let out a shriek and fled her frame. Fawkes folded his wings and looked at Harry. Then he was standing in front of him. Harry hadn't seen him move. The Phoenix was simply there, perched on the table between the salt cellar and Percy Weasley's goblet, close enough that Harry could feel the heat radiating off his feathers, which was considerable, like sitting near a hearth. His neck was level with Harry's face, and those eyes, those old, patient, volcanic eyes, were about 14 inches from Harry's own. The students on either side had scrambled backward with varying levels of dignity. Ron had shoved himself back so hard he was half off the bench. Percy had stood up entirely. Hermione Granger, whom Harry had only met properly on the train, was 3 tables away but craning her neck with an expression of absolute ferocious academic hunger, as if she was desperately wishing she had a quill. "Hello," Harry said, because it seemed rude not to. Fawkes made a sound. It was short and low and nothing like the shattering note from before, it was almost conversational. A response. Then the Phoenix reached out, very deliberately, and placed one talon on Harry's forearm. The world didn't end. Nothing exploded. But Harry felt something happen in his chest, not pain, exactly, more like the feeling of a room whose door had been locked for 11 years suddenly being opened from the outside, the way a pressurized space releases when you finally breach the seal. He breathed in, sharp, and his breath came back out differently, like the air he was exhaling was not quite the same thing as the air he'd inhaled. Fawkes looked at him. Turned his head. Looked down at Harry's arm where his talon rested. Then the Phoenix began to burn. Not catastrophically. Not wildly. It was a controlled burn, methodical, almost surgical, the kind of fire that knew exactly what it was doing and had no interest in collateral damage. The flame was intensely, almost obscenely blue at its core and gold at its edges, and it ran from Fawkes's talon up Harry's arm and disappeared into his chest, and Harry felt the layers the Sorting Hat had described. He felt them clearly, the way you can feel the structure of something when it breaks. There was his core, whatever a magical core was, he didn't have the context yet, but he knew it instinctively, the deep bright reservoir of it, and around it there were things that weren't his. Additions. Constructions. Things placed around his core the way rings of stone might be placed around a well to contain the water, to regulate how much could be drawn up at any given time. He felt Fawkes find the first one. The burn in his chest sharpened, and then a block, that was the only word for it, a block, solid and deliberately crafted and bearing in its construction the unmistakable signature of someone who had been very precise and very careful, came apart. And Harry felt the core beneath it expand, very slightly, like a breath being fully taken for the first time. Then Fawkes burned the second one. Then the third. "What is he doing?" someone in the hall said, and the voice was high with alarm. "Someone get Dumbledore," McGonagall said, and her voice was absolutely controlled, the way voices are controlled when the person speaking them is working very hard to not sound frightened. "Now." Immediately. Harry barely heard her. He was inside what was happening with his whole attention, the way you're inside a piece of music when it's the exact right piece of music and the world outside it becomes peripheral. Each block that Fawkes burned was different in construction, different in age, some of them old enough that they'd grown into his core's architecture like tree roots growing into stone, but Fawkes removed them with the same patient precision. Not destroying Harry's magic. Freeing it. 4. 5. 6. At 10, Harry heard the first person in the hall start crying and didn't understand why until he felt the ambient magic in the room and realized it was reacting to him. The candles had stopped fluctuating and had all simultaneously burned higher and brighter, not to the point of danger but to the point of extravagance, casting the entire great hall in gold. The enchanted ceiling had abandoned the night sky entirely in favor of something that looked like the inside of a flame, deep orange and amber light rippling outward from directly above where Harry sat. 11. 12. 13. At the high table, Quirrell had pushed his chair back and was gripping the edge of the table with both hands, his knuckles absolutely white. The turban on his head had tilted slightly and he didn't fix it, and the expression on his face was wrong. It was Quirrell's face doing something that Quirrell's face didn't know how to do, something more controlled and more calculating and considerably more frightened than anything Quirrell himself would have felt about a bird burning a first-year student. 14. 15. 16. McGonagall had sent a Patronus message, a silver cat, which shot through the wall and was gone, and was now standing in the center aisle between the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff tables with her wand out, not pointing it at anything, just having it, the way people hold a railing when they're standing near a ledge. 17. 18. Harry's scar had started tingling. He registered this distantly and set it aside because it seemed like the least important thing currently happening. 19. 20. He was aware of the sound in the hall, hundreds of students, terrified and fascinated in roughly equal measure, some of them crying, some of them frozen, at least one of them trying to leave and being stopped by the doors, which had sealed themselves. Hermione Granger had physically climbed up onto the Ravenclaw table to get a better view and was gripping the shoulder of the student next to her with white-knuckled intensity. Ron Weasley, whose earlier scramble away had been entirely reflex, had very quietly moved back to his seat and was sitting there again, for inches from Harry, close enough that Harry could feel his presence at his left shoulder. He wasn't doing anything. He was just there. Harry, later, would remember that. 21. 22. 23. The doors of the Great Hall flew open. Dumbledore moved through them the way people who are very old and very powerful sometimes move, quickly, without any of the theater of urgency, just efficiency, his robes sweeping behind him and his wand already in his hand and his face wearing an expression that Harry would spend a great deal of time learning to read and which currently meant something very close to "I should have expected this and I am not prepared for it." He stopped at the end of the aisle. Fawkes looked at him. The look between them lasted about 3 seconds. Then Fawkes turned back to Harry and continued. 24. "Fawkes," Dumbledore said, and his voice was quiet and careful and extraordinary for a man who just walked into a room where 600 people were in various states of shock. "Fawkes, I need you to stop." Fawkes did not stop. Can he just not listen to him? Seamus Finnegan hissed from somewhere down the bench. 25. 26. Fawkes. Dumbledore took several more steps into the hall. His usual warmth, the comfortable grandfather quality he wore like a favorite coat, was entirely absent. He looked his age, suddenly, ancient and worried and capable of being wrong. "Please." Fawkes closed his eyes briefly. It looked, absurdly, like acknowledgement. "Like I hear you. I'm not stopping." 27. 28. 29. Harry felt the wave of it building. The only honest way to describe it was more. Each block removed left more of him available to himself, and what was available was substantial, staggeringly so, the kind of power that shouldn't belong to an 11-year-old boy who'd grown up in a cupboard and had just learned magic was real 3 weeks ago. But it was his. It had always been his. It had just been, managed. Contained. The word arrived in his mind with a quality to it, a cold kind of fury that he pressed down for now and filed for later. 30. 31. "My goodness," the Bloody Baron said from somewhere to Harry's right, which was remarkable because the Bloody Baron never said anything unprompted. 32. Neville Longbottom, at the far end of the Gryffindor table, had fainted into his treacle tart and no one had noticed because everyone was watching Harry. 33. McGonagall said, very quietly and precisely, in the silence that had fallen across the entire hall like a held breath, "Albus. What have you done?" It was not a question. She knew. Or she suspected enough that the question mark was superfluous. Dumbledore said nothing. 34. Fawkes lifted his talon from Harry's arm, spread his wings, they were enormous, far larger than they had appeared when folded, filling the space above the Gryffindor table with a canopy of burning color, threw back his head, and sang. That was Phoenix song. Actual, genuine, full-throated Phoenix song, and if the earlier note had been a hammer on a bell then this was the bell itself becoming sound, the sound filling the great hall from floor to enchanted ceiling and pouring into everyone present like warm water into a cold vessel. Harry felt people around him crying and didn't have much space to judge them because his own eyes had gone absolutely blurred and he wasn't entirely sure it was emotion rather than the magical pressure in the room. The song lasted 11 seconds. Harry counted. Then Fawkes stepped off the table, rose into the air, circled Harry's head once, close enough that one wingtip touched his hair, a brief, warm pressure, and disappeared. Not dramatically. Just gone, between one moment and the next, between one wing beat and the next, with a small burst of light that left afterimages in everyone's eyes like you'd looked at a candle and then looked away. The great hall was absolutely silent. Harry sat in it. He breathed. He took an inventory of himself, the way he'd learned to do in the cupboard after Dudley had worked him over, a quick internal accounting, and found that everything felt different. Not raw or painful. Bigger. More accurate, like he'd spent his entire life seeing the world through a dirty window and someone had cleaned the glass without telling him and the world was simply that much more vivid and the trees had always had that many leaves. He became aware, gradually, that every single person in the great hall was looking at him. He looked back. "Right," he said, and his voice came out steady, which he was proud of. "What was that?" Dumbledore recovered first. He was good at recovering, Harry would learn this too, but in this instance the recovery was slightly slower than his baseline, and it showed. "Perhaps," he said, very gently, looking at Harry with an expression that was carefully and specifically warm, "this is a conversation better had in my office." "Maybe," Harry said, and he was surprised by the quality of his own voice, not rebellious, not aggressive, just level, just informational. "But everyone here already saw it. So explaining what it was doesn't really hurt anything." Several people at the Gryffindor table made small sounds. Percy Weasley's expression suggested he was filing this moment away for future reference. McGonagall was staring at Dumbledore with an expression Harry could not yet read but which was very busy. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment. His eyes, blue, very blue, and usually lit with that characteristic twinkle, were not twinkling. They were simply looking, taking Harry in with a carefulness that was entirely different from the warm vagueness he'd projected in Diagon Alley. Core enhancement, Dumbledore said, to the room, because he clearly recognized that Harry was right. Of a kind. Fawkes has demonstrated something tonight something I did not anticipate. Core enhancement. Hermione Granger had climbed down from the Ravenclaw table and was standing in the aisle, and she said it the way someone says something when they already know what it means and are checking whether the person speaking also knows. Sir, that's not enhancement. Enhancement is additive. He burned things. I could see the light for each one. 34 separate, I counted, 34 separate structures removed. That's removal. That's restriction removal. Those were blocks, weren't they? She said this last part looking at Dumbledore, and it was also not quite a question. The silence that fell after this was a different quality than the silence before. More pointed. Professor Quirrell made a small, involuntary sound and covered it with a cough. Dumbledore's expression did something complicated and then resolved into something smoother, and Harry thought, he's deciding how much of the truth to use. He knew that particular decision. He'd watched Petunia Dursley make it roughly twice a week for as long as he could remember. There are things, Dumbledore said carefully, that are complex and that deserve a proper discussion. Tonight, Harry, what matters is that you are well and that what just happened, while unusual, has not harmed you. He smiled, and it was a very good smile, technically. Are you well? Harry thought about it. Genuinely. Yeah, he said. Actually. I really am. And the strange thing, the thing that made at least 4 people within earshot shiver slightly, was how thoroughly he meant it. The quality of well in his voice wasn't relieved or surprised. It was simply accurate. Matter of fact. Like he was describing the weather. He felt Ron Weasley's hand close briefly around his forearm, the same arm where Fawkes's talon had rested, in a quick, firm grip. Bit of an entrance, mate, Ron said quietly, and his voice was doing the thing where it was being more casual than the situation warranted because he'd decided that's what was needed. Thought maybe you could have done the standard hat thing, but this works too. Harry looked at him. Ron's ears were red and his expression was determinately normal, and Harry had never in his life had a friend, not a real one, not someone who stayed in their seat. Sorry about the ceiling, Harry said. Ron glanced up at it. The enchanted ceiling had gone back to projecting stars, but they were burning somewhat brighter than they had before, with a warmth that hadn't been there at the start of the evening. Honestly? I think it's better like this. Around them, the great hall began, very slowly, to return to something resembling its previous state, students talking in rapid, low, electric voices, professors conferring at the high table, the doors unsealing themselves with a definitive click that indicated whatever charm had shut them had recognized the emergency as over. Quirrell had straightened his turban and was talking to Professor Snape, and Snape was not talking back, he was watching Harry with dark eyes that gave absolutely nothing away. Harry noticed the watching and noted it without doing anything about it. He noticed, too, the empty chair beside Neville. They'd revived him with a mild renervate, his face still marked with treacle tart, and thought about the blocks. About 34 of them. About who could construct something like that, and precisely, and carefully enough that even the Sorting Hat hadn't entirely known what it was looking at. He thought about the way Dumbledore had said I did not anticipate this rather than I do not know what this is. 2 very different statements. He filed that away too, next to the cold word contained, and ate his dinner. The food that appeared on the table in front of him was excellent. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, since the Dursleys had been in one of their periods of deliberate deprivation, and he was absolutely not going to let the events of the last 20 minutes interfere with treacle tart. Ron watched him eat with an expression of straightforward admiration. You're very calm. I'm hungry, Harry said. Right. That's fair. Hermione appeared at his elbow, which required her to squeeze between 3 students who were absolutely in her way and who she navigated around with her elbow and her determination and no particular acknowledgement. She sat down across from Harry and looked at him with an expression of such concentrated intellectual urgency that he felt slightly like a specimen. 34, she said. I know. I felt them. Her expression shifted, still intent but now differently so, less like a researcher looking at data and more like a person realizing the data is a person. What did they feel like? Harry thought about it, turning his fork over. Like getting your glasses prescription fixed. But for everything. She stared at him. That's the most accurate magical metaphor I've heard all week, and I've been reading constantly all week. She really has, Ron confirmed, leaning across Harry to speak to Hermione. She's been driving the prefects mad. I heard from Percy. He seemed to remember Percy was 2 seats away and lowered his voice. She's read more of the library already than some 6th years. Hermione looked caught between pleasure and irritation at this characterization. I'm thorough. You told Flitwick he'd mispronounced Wingardium Leviosa on page 6 of his own textbook. He had. Before your first class. Yes. Before the class. I like to be prepared. Harry was watching both of them and feeling something uncurl in his chest that had nothing to do with Fawkes and everything to do with the specific, unreplicable warmth of sitting at a table with people who were already becoming his people, which was something he had read about in books but never quite believed he'd personally experience. The blocks, Hermione said, pulling her attention back with visible effort. The theory, there are old texts about core restriction. It was practiced in the 1400s, mostly. Illegal now. Has been since 1702. She paused. It would have to be done to someone very young, for it to integrate as completely as, for no one to have noticed. For even a diagnostic examination to not necessarily catch it, it would have to be done in infancy. The words settled on the table between them. Ron's ears had gone from red to not red in a transition that meant he'd gone past embarrassed into something else, something quieter. Hermione. It's relevant, she said, but her voice had changed too. You're telling him he was, I'm observing that the evidence suggests, Hermione. Harry said it gently. Both of them stopped. He looked at her. I know. Or I've figured that much out. It's okay. He paused. Well. Not okay. But it's, I know. She held his gaze for a moment. Nodded. The intense academic light in her eyes shifted to something human and level and honestly quite fierce. Someone did this to you on purpose. When you were very young. She said it plainly, because he'd established that he could handle plainness, and he appreciated it. And someone else's familiar just unmade it. Publicly. Yeah. I'm going to find out everything there is to know about it. I figured. I'll need library access. Including restricted, Hermione. Right. Starting with what's available. She smoothed her robes, sat up straighter. This is extremely serious and also possibly the most interesting thing I've ever been in the vicinity of. Balance of priorities, Ron observed. I said also. It's a conjunction. It means both things are true simultaneously. Harry laughed. It surprised him, the quality of it, the realness of it, the fact that it came out of him at the end of this particular evening when he had discovered that someone had been quietly containing him for 11 years and Dumbledore had stood in a doorway deciding how much truth to use. He laughed, and Ron looked at him sideways and grinned, and even Hermione's expression went briefly and helplessly soft. At the high table, Dumbledore watched the 3 of them across the length of the great hall, his supper untouched, his hands folded in front of him, and wore the expression of someone revising a very long-standing set of calculations. McGonagall came to stand beside him. She said nothing for a moment. Neither did he. Albus, she said finally, and it was remarkable how many things she put into just his name, a whole precise vocabulary of feeling, none of it comfortable, all of it clear. I know, Minerva. You told me, in 1981, you told me it was a protective measure. You used those exact words. It was. It is. He was too visible, too extraordinary, and if the remaining Death Eaters had understood what was, he is 11 years old, she said, and her voice was absolutely controlled, which meant she was furious, which he knew, which was perhaps why he didn't argue. He has been walking around for 11 years with that done to him, without his knowledge or his parents' knowledge, without any. There was no consent, Albus, there was no one to give consent, Dumbledore said quietly. His parents were dead. He was 1 year old. The decision required, you, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Yes. Me. McGonagall looked at Harry, across the length of the hall, at the small dark-haired boy who was laughing at something the Weasley boy had said, who was sitting up straight without effort for the first time in anyone's recollection, who was wearing the specific ease of someone whose weight had been adjusted to match their actual capacity to carry it. Well, she said. Fawkes has rendered the point somewhat moot. She paused. Although I believe Fawkes may have intended to render the point somewhat moot. Deliberately. Dumbledore said nothing. I find it interesting, she continued, taking a small sip of her water in a gesture that was profoundly controlled, that your familiar chose tonight. The first night. Before anything else could be set in motion. Fawkes has always had his own counsel. She set her glass down with a precision that was somehow pointed. And how long has Fawkes had his own counsel, and how long has he known about Harry, and how long, Albus, has your own familiar disagreed with your decisions about that boy before tonight? Dumbledore looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had been very carefully honest for a very long time and was now being asked to account for the spaces between the honesty. A while, he said. McGonagall closed her eyes for 2 seconds. Opened them. I want to be involved in whatever conversation you have with him. Minerva, that is not a request. Her voice was perfectly calm and absolutely immovable. He's a Gryffindor. He's my student. And you are going to sit in that chair and have an honest conversation with him, and I am going to be in the room when you do, and if you use the word complex as a way of not answering a direct question I will personally confiscate your lemon drops for the remainder of term. Despite everything, the corner of Dumbledore's mouth moved. Just slightly. That would be unusually harsh, Minerva. I am feeling unusually harsh. She looked at Harry one more time. He asked you a direct question in front of 600 students and you didn't answer it. He was 11 years old and he knew you were hedging. Think about what that means. She walked back to her own chair with the absolute precision of someone who has said the most important thing and is done saying it. Dumbledore sat with the untouched supper, and looked at the boy at the Gryffindor table who was now engaged in an animated conversation about Quidditch, of all things, gesturing with his fork and making Ron Weasley laugh so hard he inhaled pumpkin juice, and thought about what it meant to love something and also to manage it, and whether those two things had ever been separable in his hands, and whether Fawkes, who had chosen tonight, deliberately, publicly, irrevocably, had always known. They weren't. Harry, finishing his treacle tart, thought about 34 blocks and a phoenix's eyes and the way McGonagall had said what have you done in a voice that didn't need a question mark. He thought about the cold word contained still sitting in its file. He thought, not anymore. He reached for more tart. Outside the enchanted ceiling, the real September sky had the particular quality of late summer transitioning to autumn, warm still, but with an edge to it, the first suggestion of a coming season. Inside the great hall, the candles burned a degree brighter than they had at the start of term, and a degree brighter than they would burn anywhere else in the country that night, and would continue to do so for reasons the castle's enchantments couldn't quite account for through any of their usual parameters. Harry Potter, sitting between Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger, who had migrated from the Ravenclaw table without apparently noticing she'd done so and would rectify this after dessert, felt for the first time in his life like he was sitting exactly where he was supposed to be, taking up exactly as much space as was his to take up, and burning at exactly the temperature that was honestly, accurately, finally his own. Chapter 2, The Weight of 34. The Owls arrived at breakfast the next morning like a weather event. Harry had been at Hogwarts for approximately 14 hours, which meant he had slept in a four-poster bed for the first time in his life, eaten a breakfast that involved actual bacon, and had not yet been to a single class. None of that mattered, because at 7:43 in the morning the owls came through the high windows of the great hall in a formation that was less a delivery and more a statement, 30, 40, 50 of them, banking in organized chaos above the four tables, dropping letters and packages and rolled parchments with the efficiency of something that had been building overnight. Most of them landed at the Gryffindor table. Specifically, most of them landed near Harry. He stared at the pile accumulating in front of him. Ron, who'd been mid-sentence about Quidditch, stopped talking and stared with him. Hermione, across the table with a textbook open beside her porridge, looked up and went very still. "That's," Ron started. "A lot of owls," Harry finished. "You don't have a subscription to anything, do you?" "I've been in the wizarding world for 3 weeks." "Right." Ron picked up the letter closest to him and looked at the seal. "Put it down." Picked up another one. "Harry, this one's from the Wizengamot." Hermione closed her textbook. That, more than anything, communicated the seriousness of the moment. Harry pulled the nearest letter toward him and opened it. The handwriting was precise and bureaucratic, the kind of handwriting that had been trained into exactness by decades of official correspondence, and it read, "Mr. Potter, the Department of Magical Law Enforcement requests your attendance at a preliminary inquiry regarding the magical event of September 1st at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, specifically the identification and removal of unauthorized core restriction enchantments, as witnessed by approximately 600 individuals and documented in the attached preliminary report. This is not a punitive inquiry. Your well-being is the primary concern of," Harry set it down. Picked up another. This one had a crest he didn't recognize, a phoenix, ironically, over a background of crossed wands. "Dear Mr. Potter, the ancient and noble house of Potter has an outstanding vault at Gringotts containing documentation regarding all enchantments placed upon the heir of the house by parties outside the immediate family. Given the events of last evening, which we at Gringotts are legally required to acknowledge as a formal magical unsealing, you are entitled to a full accounting of," he set that one down too. "Hermione," he said. "I'm reading," she said, because she'd already taken the one from the Wizengamot and had it open in front of her. "What does it mean, legally?" "The unsealing." She was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving rapidly. "It means that when Fawkes removed the restrictions, it created a magical event that has a legal classification. Core restriction is illegal, has been since 1702, and the removal of it triggers a series of automatic notifications, Gringotts, the Ministry, the Wizengamot, and anyone with a vested legal interest in your welfare." She looked up. "Harry, your family vault has been sitting with documentation of this for 10 years. Gringotts knew. They're legally obligated not to disclose without the account holder's request, but they knew." Ron had gone quiet in the specific way he went quiet when things stopped being interesting and started being upsetting. "So loads of people knew something was done to you and just kept it in a file somewhere." "Not loads of people," Hermione said carefully. "The enchantment itself would have been placed by one person, or possibly two. The documentation is a separate matter. Gringotts records all enchantments on account holders automatically. They're a bank. They track assets." "I'm an asset," Harry said. He said it without particular heat. Hermione looked at him directly. "I will find out exactly what you are and are not by the time I'm done. But for now, don't respond to any of these." She was already sorting through the pile with quick hands. "This one's from the Daily Prophet, ignore it. This one's from someone called Madame Marchbanks, keep it, she's on the Wizengamot and she's serious. This one," she stopped. "What?" She turned the letter so he could see it. The seal was silver and green and the handwriting on the front was elegant in the way that made you feel vaguely insufficient. "Harry Potter," it said. "First class, Hogwarts. No crest. No return address." "Don't open that one yet," Hermione said. "Why?" "Because it's warded. I can feel it from here and I don't know what the ward does yet." She set it carefully aside. Later, with precautions. Ron leaned over and looked at it. That's a Slytherin-looking letter. You can't tell which house a letter is from by looking at it, Hermione said. You can, actually, a bit. He pulled back. Harry, mate, how are you all right? You're being very quiet. Harry was being quiet because he was reading the letter from Gringotts again, specifically the part that said by parties outside the immediate family, which meant it hadn't been his parents. His parents had been dead. It had been done after his parents were dead, which he'd already worked out, but seeing it in formal bank language made it real in a way the working out hadn't quite managed. I'm fine, he said. I want to talk to Dumbledore today. Ron and Hermione exchanged a look across the table. Not a concerned look, exactly, more a look that acknowledged that this was both reasonable and likely to be interesting. McGonagall said last night there'd be a meeting, Hermione offered. After classes. After classes, Harry repeated. Right. Classes first. He pulled his timetable toward him and looked at it. We've got Transfiguration this morning. I've already read the first 3 chapters of the Transfiguration textbook, Hermione said. Of course you have. And chapters 4 and 5. Good morning, said Neville Longbottom, arriving at the table and sitting next to Harry with the specific exhaustion of someone who'd had a complicated night. He had a small smear of treacle tart still, somehow, behind his left ear. Is it true you got a letter from the ministry? And Gringotts, Ron said. And the Wizengamot, Hermione added. Neville looked at the pile of correspondence. Blimey. He picked up a piece of toast. My Gran's going to be furious she missed it. She loves the Wizengamot. Harry looked at him. Missed what? Neville gestured vaguely, a gesture that encompassed the whole of last night. All of it. She'll read about it in the Prophet this morning and she'll be on the phone, on the flu, sorry, she says the Prophet gets everything wrong but she reads it anyway. He paused, toast halfway to his mouth. Are you actually all right? You were, last night was, I'm good, Harry said, and because he could feel Neville's genuine concern rather than his fascination, he added, really. Better than I've been in a while, honestly. Neville chewed his toast and thought about this. Okay. He said it simply, which Harry appreciated. What have we got first? Transfiguration. Neville made a face that suggested complex feelings about transfiguration. I can help, Hermione offered immediately. I know, Neville said, in the tone of someone who was not entirely sure being helped by Hermione Granger was an uncomplicated experience. Thanks. The post owls had thinned out, the last few stragglers delivering things to other students who were watching Harry's table with a range of expressions from openly fascinated to studied casual. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy, who'd been sorted 2 students before Harry and had watched the entire Fawkes incident with an expression Harry couldn't read from across the room, was speaking to the 2 large boys who appeared to function as his entourage, and he was doing it without looking in Harry's direction, which somehow felt more pointed than if he'd stared. Harry noticed this and filed it alongside the other things he was filing, which was becoming quite a collection. He ate his eggs, drank his pumpkin juice, and listened to Ron's extensive and passionate breakdown of the Gryffindor Quidditch team's chances this season, which involved a lot of hand gestures and at least 2 impressions of the previous year's keeper's technique that made Neville inhale his toast. By the time they headed out to Transfiguration, the great pile of correspondence had been sorted, the important ones tucked inside Harry's bag and the rest left for later, and the morning felt, against all reasonable expectation, almost normal. The castle didn't. Walking through it was different from how Harry imagined it would be based on last night's arrival, when everything had been too new and too much to process properly. This morning, with the shock of the sorting behind him and Fawkes's work settled into him like, the prescription glasses metaphor really was the best one, walking through the corridors was an experience in texture. He could feel the castle's magic. Not distantly, the way you might feel warmth from a fire across a room. Directly, immediately, like a current running through the stones beneath his feet and the walls at his sides, like the castle was a living thing aware of the people moving through it, and it was, paying attention. To him specifically, in the way a conversation pays attention to the most interesting person in the room. Hermione, he said, as they took the second staircase on the left. Can a building be aware of people? She looked at him sharply. Why? The castle feels, it knows I'm here. Like it's noticing me. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her pulling something from her extensive reading. Hogwarts has sentient enchantments. The founders built them in, they're part of what makes the moving staircases and the changing layout work. The castle has something like a rudimentary consciousness. Or at least, awareness. She paused. Most people can't feel it. You have to have a fairly high level of ambient magical sensitivity. Which I now have. Which you now have, she agreed, and there was something in her voice that was working very hard to be academic and was also just a little bit wondering. Ron, on Harry's other side, put his hand on the wall of the corridor experimentally. Waited. I don't feel anything. You probably wouldn't, Hermione said, not unkindly. That's a bit, Harry, the castle knows you're here. Harry put his own hand on the wall for a moment. The stone was cool and also somehow not, in the way a sleeping person's hand is cool to the touch but you know there's warmth running underneath. Not knows. More like, notices. The way you'd notice a sound. Ron looked at the wall. At Harry. Can you ask it things? I don't think it works like that. But theoretically. Harry thought about it. Looked at the stones, old, very old, older than anyone alive, fitted together with the patient precision of people who had understood that the things you built while thinking about centuries lasted longer than the things you built while thinking about years. Maybe eventually, he said. Not yet. They walked on, and the castle hummed around Harry in a register just below sound. Transfiguration was held in a room on the first floor that smelled like concentration and chalk and something faintly smoky, and Professor McGonagall was already there when they arrived, not waiting for them but having been there long enough to rearrange things to her precise satisfaction, which gave the room the quality of a space she inhabited rather than occupied. She was a tabby cat on the desk when they filed in, and she waited until they'd all sat down and started whispering to each other before transforming, which Harry suspected was partly pedagogical and partly because she enjoyed the specific silence of 31st years discovering their professor had been sitting on the front desk as a cat for the past 10 minutes. Transfiguration, she said, in the voice of someone who considered their subject the most serious thing in the building, is not a parlor trick. It is not the sort of magic you perform to impress people at parties. It is the alteration of the fundamental nature of matter, and it is consequently the most demanding and the most powerful branch of magic you will study at this school. She paused, scanning the room. It is also the most dangerous if approached without discipline. Which is why this class begins with theory. She was looking at the class in general but the quick pass of her eyes to Harry at this last statement was brief and precise and said, without words, this applies to you specifically, given current circumstances. Harry met her look with an equally level one that said, without words, I understand and I also know you want to talk to me. She looked away. It was a very efficient exchange. The theory part of the lesson was 40 minutes of note-taking so dense that Neville's quill was moving almost constantly and his notes still lagged behind. Hermione's hand was a blur. Ron's notes were shorter but surprisingly accurate, because Ron had the gift of synthesis. He could listen to 10 minutes of lecture and produce 3 sentences that contained the actual point, which Hermione's 12 paragraphs also contained but were harder to find in. Harry's notes were different. He wrote what McGonagall said, but around the edges of the parchment, in smaller writing, he also wrote questions. Not the questions you wrote down meaning to ask them later and then didn't, real questions, things that snagged on what she was saying, things that didn't fit cleanly against what he could now feel in himself. McGonagall demonstrated the match-to-needle transfiguration. The match became a needle with the precise inevitability of something done 10,000 times. She looked at the class. Try. The results were varied. Hermione's match sprouted a pointed end within 30 seconds but retained a faint wooden quality that she found deeply unsatisfying, based on her expression. Ron's went vaguely metallic in color but remained resolutely match-shaped. Neville's didn't move, but he was making excellent eye contact with it and whispering encouragement, which McGonagall seemed to find both endearing and insufficient. Harry looked at his match. He thought about what transfiguration was, according to McGonagall's theory, not making a thing look different but actually changing what it was, at the level of its fundamental structure. He thought about what Fawkes had done, which was also a fundamental change to structure, and the comparison was wrong in the details but right in the underlying mechanism. You couldn't force the change. You had to understand what you were asking the thing to become, and ask it with enough precision and enough conviction that the asking was more real than the thing's current state. He didn't say the incantation. He just asked the match. It became a needle. Not gradually, not with the wooden qualities that Hermione's had retained in its first attempt. Fully, cleanly, immediately, a needle, silver, perfectly proportioned, sitting on his desk in the space where the match had been. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens. McGonagall appeared at his shoulder. She looked at the needle. She picked it up, testing it between her fingers, checking its quality, and set it back down. "Correct," she said. "It helps," Harry offered, because her expression was asking a question, if you think of it as, if you understand what you want it to be very clearly. Not just the shape. What it actually is. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "That is, in fact, the theoretical basis of the entire discipline, which I have been teaching for 39 years. Would you like to try the needle back into a match?" "Sure." He did. It took him 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than he expected because turning something back to what it had been was harder than turning it into something new. There was something sticky about returning, something that required acknowledging the original form was the correct one. He found that interesting. Said McGonagall, looking at both the needle and then the match and then at Harry, and the sound contained multitudes. He stayed after class. Not because she asked him to, she hadn't, quite, but the way she'd looked at him as the other students filed out was the look of someone who had things to say and had been waiting for the appropriate moment. Ron and Hermione waited in the corridor. He could hear them through the open door, Ron's voice explaining something about Quidditch and Hermione's voice clearly not engaged with the topic but tolerating it out of proximity. McGonagall closed the door. She sat on the edge of her desk, not behind it, which would have been the formal position, but on the edge, which was the position of someone who was going to speak plainly. "How are you this morning?" she asked. "Fine. Better than fine. You've received correspondence. From several official places, yes." He paused. "You knew. Before last night." She looked at him carefully. "I suspected. There were. I'm your head of house. I reviewed your file, as I do with all incoming students. There were things in it that I questioned, and I raised those questions with Dumbledore." She paused. "I was satisfied with his answers in a way that I now find I'm reassessing." "What did he tell you?" "That the measures taken were protective. That there were forces who would have sought you out if your full magical signature had been visible. That it was temporary." She held his gaze. "He did not specify a timeline for temporary. Or that he hadn't mentioned it to me at all." "No." Harry nodded slowly. He was running the facts alongside his feelings in the way he'd learned to do when the feelings were strong enough to interfere with clarity. Both were there, the cold fact of it and the ember warmth of the anger he was carefully not letting run away from him. "I want to understand why 34. Why that specific number? What that means about what was there." McGonagall breathed out steadily. "I've been in contact with a colleague at the Department of Magical Abilities. What Fawkes removed last night, 34 restrictors of that caliber and that age, represents a degree of magical capacity that has no modern precedent that I can find. The closest historical comparison is," she paused. I want to be careful about comparisons, because every comparison carries connotations I don't necessarily want to attach to you. Say it anyway. She met his eyes. The last witch or wizard documented with a core of this magnitude, before whatever restrictions were placed, was Merlin. She waited to see what he'd do with that. Harry thought about it. Merlin. As I said, I don't want the comparison to, no, I heard you. He was quiet for a moment. I don't feel like Merlin. What do you feel like? He thought about it honestly. I feel like me. But without the weight. She was quiet for a moment. Yes. I imagine that's accurate. She stood, moved back around her desk, which re-established some professional formality that she seemed to need. The meeting this evening is at 7. Dumbledore's office. I will be there. Thank you. Learn things today, she said. Pay attention in your other classes. The world has not suspended itself because of last night, and you have 11 years of education to get through. She picked up her wand and turned back to her desk of papers in a way that indicated the conversation was complete. Harry got to the door and then stopped. Professor Potter. Does it usually, he tried to find the right words. When I was walking through it this morning, it felt like it was paying attention to me. Is that normal? She put her papers down. Hogwarts has a rudimentary consciousness, as Miss Granger has likely already informed you. She paused. However, in 39 years of working in this castle, I have only ever heard of it paying active attention to a student on 3 occasions. What were the 3? The first was a student in 1472 who demonstrated an unusual affinity for structural magic and later became the primary architect of the ministry's main chamber. She lined her papers up. The second was a student in 1957 who I taught myself, briefly, before she left. A pause. The third is you, as of this morning. Harry absorbed this. What happened to the 1957 student? McGonagall looked at him steadily. She had a difficult relationship with the wizarding establishment and eventually left Britain. She's still alive, I believe, and teaching privately in Portugal. She picked her quill back up. The castle, she added, chose well on both previous occasions. Go to your next class, Potter. He went. Charms with Flitwick was in a different tower, up a staircase that had decided this morning to be slightly longer than it was architecturally supposed to be, the castle's mischief, which Harry experienced as a kind of fond obstacle rather than an annoyance. Flitwick himself was a tiny man who stood on a pile of books to see over his own desk and vibrated with genuine enthusiasm for his subject in a way that Harry found immediately appealing. The charm lesson was Lumos, basic, foundational, the light charm Harry had practiced on the train 3 weeks ago. He held back during the lesson, doing it at the level of competence that matched the rest of the class, not because he was hiding but because learning the underpinnings of how it worked was more interesting than demonstrating that he already could. What he was actually paying attention to was the mechanism. The way a charm was structured, the incantation carrying the intent, the wand motion carrying the direction, the power from the core providing the actual fuel. With 34 blocks removed, he could feel the mechanism the way you could feel the components of a clock if someone handed you each gear separately and asked you to understand them before reassembling. Everything was visible now. Everything was clear. After class, Flitwick detained him with approximately the same casual not casual precision McGonagall had used. Mr. Potter, he said, when the classroom had emptied. Lumos. Harry lit his wand. Standard Lumos, clean and steady. Said Flitwick. Now without the wand. Harry looked at him. Flitwick's expression was cheerful and absolutely serious simultaneously, which was a combination Harry was learning to respect. Last night's events have been documented by the Department of Magical Abilities, and based on their preliminary assessment, you are what we historically call an ambient caster, a witch or wizard whose magical output does not require a focal tool for execution. He paused. Your wand will be useful. It is an excellent focusing instrument and will remain so. But we are both aware that it is not strictly necessary for you. Harry thought about the troll he hadn't yet encountered, the magic that had come out of him in the cupboard at the Dursleys when he'd been desperate enough, the way the match had become a needle this morning without his wand at his desk, though he'd had it, he'd reached for it, he'd held it, but looking back he wasn't sure he'd used it. He looked at Flitwick's desk. At the stack of parchment sitting on the edge of it. He didn't gesture toward it. He didn't think about it dramatically. He just moved it, with the same quality of attention he'd given the match, and the stack of parchment slid 18 inches to the left and stopped exactly where he'd intended it to stop. Flitwick beamed. "Yes," he said. "That. We need to be very careful about how we discuss this, Mr. Potter, because the Ministry's classification for ambient casters is complicated, and I don't want your first week at school to involve Ministry interference in your education." He climbed down from his stack of books, which were themselves charmed, and moved around the desk. "What I am going to do is give you independent study materials for wandless application alongside your regular coursework, and what you are going to do is be discreet." "Not hide," Harry said. "No. Not hide. Discreet. There is a difference." Flitwick looked up at him with bright, sharp eyes. "The former is shame. The latter is strategy." "Okay," Harry said. "Strategy one can do." He thought Ron Weasley would have liked Flitwick considerably. Lunch was a complicated affair. The Great Hall had a quality now that Harry would come to think of as the morning after a lightning strike quality, everyone trying to return to normal while also fundamentally not being able to stop looking at where the lightning had hit. People watched him across tables. He watched them back, which seemed to discomfit them, because they'd expected him not to notice. There was also the matter of Draco Malfoy. Malfoy had been, on the Hogwarts Express, precisely what his accent and his posture and his expectation of deference suggested, a boy who had never been told no by anyone who mattered to him, performing confidence so constantly that he'd probably forgotten it was a performance. He'd offered his hand in the corridor and Harry had not taken it, partly because of what Hagrid had said about good and bad, and partly because the specific way Malfoy had looked at Ron while doing it had told Harry everything he needed to know about the terms of that offer. Now, at the Slytherin table, Malfoy was watching Harry eat with an expression that was calculating in a way that didn't quite fit an 11-year-old, that had the quality of something half-remembered from adult conversations he wasn't supposed to have heard. When Harry met his gaze, Malfoy held it for exactly 3 seconds and then looked away, deliberately, not nervously. "I see you. I am choosing to look away. This is not retreat." It was actually rather impressive, Harry thought, for someone their age. "He's going to be a problem," Ron said, not looking at Malfoy, because Ron had been practicing the art of talking about people while looking at his food since approximately age 5, having 6 siblings in a small house. "Probably," Harry agreed. "His dad's on the board of governors. Mum's mentioned him. Lucius Malfoy. He was." Ron lowered his voice. "Death Eater. Got out of it after. Said he was under Imperius. Do you think he was?" Ron chewed his sandwich. "I think he's got a very good solicitor." Hermione had been watching the Malfoy table with her book open beside her, doing the thing where she appeared to be reading while actually doing something else entirely. "He came over this morning," she said quietly. "To the Ravenclaw table. Before I'd moved." Harry and Ron both looked at her. "He was very polite," she said. "He asked me about my research. He knew I'd been reading. He said a Muggleborn who reads the right books could find herself in a considerably more comfortable position than one who didn't." She paused. "He was polite in exactly the way that something sharp can look smooth until you pick it up." "What did you say?" Ron asked. "I said the books I'd been reading suggested that blood status had no correlation with magical capacity, and that I appreciated the advice and would take it under consideration." She turned a page she hadn't read. "He went away." "Smart," Harry said. "He's not stupid," she said. "That's actually the concern. The stupid ones are less interesting. She looked at Harry. He wanted to talk about you, ultimately. He was working around to it. What was I going to do about the Potter situation? Did I think it was going to affect the school's stability? Wasn't it interesting that some people couldn't seem to help causing scenes on their very first night? She paused. He's 11 years old and he's already operating a social information network. Like I said, Ron muttered. Problem. Harry ate his sandwich and thought about a boy who'd grown up hearing a particular set of conversations, who had a particular set of tools for navigating a world that had already decided who was important and who wasn't, and who was currently recalibrating those tools for a situation the conversations hadn't anticipated. He thought Malfoy might actually be interesting, given time. After lunch was History of Magic, a grey ghost named Professor Binns who taught the subject with the enthusiasm of someone who had never liked it, which was a peculiar attribute in a teacher, and who spoke in a tone so flat it seemed to actively resist comprehension. Hermione took extraordinary notes. Ron fell asleep with his eyes technically open, a skill Harry found genuinely impressive. Neville tried very hard and got increasingly confused. Harry sat in the back and let the drone of Binns wash over him and thought about the evening's meeting. He thought about what questions to ask. Not the obvious ones, those were easy, and Dumbledore would be prepared for easy. He thought about the questions that came from the edges, the things that didn't quite line up, the gaps between what he'd been told about his parents' deaths and what Hagrid had told him and what the letters this morning had said. The things that connected. He'd learned, in 11 years of Dursley management, that the interesting information was never in what people said. It was in what they'd decided not to say, and what that decision told you about what they were protecting. He pulled out a piece of parchment and a quill and began writing questions. Not for Dumbledore to answer. For himself. A map of what he didn't know, which was the only honest starting point. By the time Binns had reached the Goblin Rebellion of 1752, Harry had 2 parchments full. Potions was last. Severus Snape was exactly as described by the book Harry had found on Hogwarts faculty in the school library, youngest person to achieve a mastery in potions in the last 2 centuries, head of Slytherin House, reputedly the most demanding professor at the school and proud of it. What the book had failed to adequately convey was the specific quality of his attention, which was the attention of someone who filed everything and discarded nothing and had been building a comprehensive inventory of the world for decades. He looked at Harry when Harry walked in, and the look was nothing like the curious fascination that most people's looks had contained since last night. It was more like recognition of something he'd already factored in, which had now been recalculated. An adjustment in an existing equation. "Potter," he said, when the class had settled. His voice was quiet and had the quality of something that moved into the available space in a room rather than pushing through it. "Tell me, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" He'd done this to 4 other students already. It was clearly not a genuine teaching question, it was a territorial question, the kind whose purpose was to establish hierarchy through demonstrated ignorance. Harry had read Advanced Potion Making on the train. He'd read it because it was in his book pile and he had nothing else to do and it was more interesting than watching the countryside. "Draught of Living Death," he said. "One of the most powerful sleeping potions known. The asphodel and wormwood combination is, the wormwood provides the base activation, the asphodel acts as a magical catalyst and gives it the depth that takes the sleep past ordinary and into something closer to a suspension of vital function." He paused. "The preparation is extremely precise. Temperature sensitive at 3 separate stages." The classroom was very quiet. Snape looked at him with the expression of someone whose move has been matched. "Where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar?" "Stomach of a goat. Acts as an antidote for most poisons." "You'd want to know which poison first, though, because a bezoar isn't universal, it's broad spectrum, not absolute." He met Snape's gaze evenly. "If you're planning to use it as a teaching prop rather than actually poisoning someone, most quality potion suppliers keep them in stock." Someone at the Gryffindor table let out a sound that was half laugh, half horror, which they immediately suppressed. Snape's expression didn't change in any way that was visible to someone who wasn't watching very carefully, but his eyes recalibrated. 5 points from Gryffindor for impertinence, he said, without particular heat. The answer was sufficient. Thank you, Professor. The lesson itself was the basics, standard first-year potion ingredients, identifying them by sight and smell. Snape walked the room with the specific quality of someone who could find something wrong with absolutely any piece of work if they wanted to, and who was deciding, on a student-by-student basis, whether they wanted to. He spent a long time looking at Neville's preparation and said, quietly and precisely, several things that made Neville's hands shake more rather than less. Harry noted this. Filed it. When Snape paused at Harry's station, he looked at the arrangement of ingredients, correctly identified, correctly prepared, in the correct order. He said nothing and moved on. Not approval. Not disapproval. Just, recalibration, again, this time for the potions bench. After the lesson, as students were filing out, Snape said, Potter. A moment. Harry stayed. The other students filed past, Ron hanging back at the door, which Harry met with a small gesture that meant it's fine, I'll catch up. Snape stood by his desk and looked at Harry with the particular attention Harry was getting good at recognizing as the kind that wasn't about what had happened the night before in the sorting but was about something older and more complicated. Your father, Snape said, was a mediocre potions student who coasted on natural aptitude and the willingness of others to do his groundwork. He said this conversationally, not cruelly, a statement of fact as he perceived it. You answered those questions from a textbook you've clearly read but not yet applied. There is a significant gap between those two things. I know, Harry said. Snape looked at him, a more careful look, this time, adjusting for the fact that Harry had not been defensive. The events of last night, he said, and it was the first time anyone today had addressed them without a preamble or a careful setup, are going to attract significant attention to you. Most of it will be unhelpful. I know that too. What you may not know, Snape said, is that attention of that kind carries a specific danger in this environment. There are people in this school who were Death Eaters. There are people in this school whose families were Death Eaters and who were raised with a particular understanding of what Harry Potter represents. He paused. You are now considerably more than they believed you were, and they have had one night to adjust to that. Harry met his eyes. Are you telling me to be careful? I'm telling you to be aware, Snape said. There's a difference. He turned back to his desk. Which you seem to have grasped from Professor Flitwick's lesson this morning, based on your afternoon restraint. Harry blinked. You know about that already. This is a small castle, Potter. He didn't look up from his papers. Go. Harry went, and added Snape to the list of people who were being more honest with him than they were being polished, which was a smaller list than you'd expect and therefore more valuable. The evening meeting was in Dumbledore's office, reached via a gargoyle that moved aside for a password Harry didn't have and that McGonagall, who collected him from the Gryffindor common room, said with the clipped efficiency of someone who found the password embarrassing. It was Fizzing Wisby, which Harry thought was somewhat incongruous for one of the most powerful wizards alive, and then thought it probably wasn't incongruous at all, it was perfectly considered, a specific kind of soft whimsy deployed as consistent characterization. The office was circular and packed with instruments Harry had no names for yet, silver things on spindles that spun or puffed or made small sounds, and portraits of previous headmasters sleeping in their frames or watching from beneath lowered eyelids. A perch near the window was empty, and Harry looked at the empty perch and understood that Fawkes was choosing, deliberately, not to be here for this. Which told him something. Dumbledore was behind his desk. He gestured to the chairs opposite, 2 of them, which meant he'd known McGonagall was coming, which meant she'd told him and he'd had time to prepare. Harry noted this. He sat in one chair. McGonagall sat in the other. Harry noticed she'd chosen the one on the right, which was fractionally closer to Dumbledore's desk, a positioning that said I am not a neutral party. Dumbledore's eyes, in the lamplight of the office, were very blue and very tired. He looked, Harry thought, like a person who had been waiting for a conversation they'd hoped to delay indefinitely and now found themselves at it. "Harry," he said. "Thank you for coming." "You wanted to talk," Harry said. "So did I." He pulled out his parchment, the 2 pages of questions, and set them on his knee. "Can I start?" Dumbledore looked at the parchment. Something in his expression did a quick, complicated thing and resolved. "Yes," he said. "Ask." "Who placed the restrictions?" Silence. Not an evasive silence, a genuine one, a person deciding how to be honest. "I did." McGonagall's jaw moved slightly and then went still. "When?" Harry asked. "November 1st, 1981. You were 15 months old." He held Harry's gaze steadily, which Harry noted. People who lie don't always look away, the good ones hold eye contact very deliberately. But Dumbledore's eyes had a quality of genuinely being there that was different. He was being looked at, not looked through. "You had been brought to your aunt and uncle's house by Hagrid, on my instruction. The restrictions were placed on the second morning. Who else knew?" "2 people. Both are dead." "Were any of them my parents' choices?" "No. Flat, clean, no decoration." "So you decided alone?" "Yes." Harry looked at him. Dumbledore looked back. "Why 34? "Because your core at 15 months was already so substantial that I was, 34 blocks were what was required to bring your magical signature to a level that would not be detectable by those who were looking for extraordinary magical children. After your parents' deaths, there were Death Eaters who had not been caught, who were looking. Voldemort was gone but not, he was diminished, but several of his followers remained, and they were," he paused. "They would have found you. The magical signature you presented last night would have found you the attention of people I was not prepared to protect you from at age 15 months. But you didn't remove them when I was older." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "No. Why not?" The quiet this time was longer. McGonagall was watching Dumbledore with an attention that was precise and still. "Because," Dumbledore said, "as you grew, and as it became clearer what you would eventually need to face, it seemed," he stopped. "Tried again. I told myself that the restrictions were protective. They were, initially. But I also told myself that a less visible, less extraordinary you was a safer you. And then, there was a version of the future I could see, in which you would need to walk towards something very dark, and it seemed, it was easier to believe that a contained version of you would do that more readily than a free one," Harry said. Dumbledore closed his eyes. "Opened them." "Yes." The word sat in the office between them. McGonagall was no longer looking at Dumbledore. Harry sat with it. He let himself feel it, the full weight of the calculation, the future planning, the careful management of a child who was also an asset in someone else's design. He let himself feel it clearly and then he put it somewhere inside him where it would keep but wouldn't run. "That's going to matter later," he said. "What you just said. We're going to have to deal with it. But right now I want to ask you something else." Dumbledore seemed slightly taken aback by the later. "Yes. Who is Lord Voldemort, relative to me? Not the public version. Not the fairy tale version. What is the actual connection, and what is the actual plan, and what am I actually supposed to be doing here?" Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "You are 11 years old. With a magical core that apparently hasn't been seen since Merlin," Harry said. "And no blocks on it. And 2 pages of questions I'd like answered." He let the parchment rest on his knee, not aggressively, just visibly. "I'm not going to be managed. I understand you care about my well-being, I believe that, I actually do. But there's a version of caring that involves deciding for someone, and that's not," he paused. "That's not what I'm going to accept. So you can either tell me what's actually happening, and we work together with me knowing the whole picture, or you don't, and I find out another way, which I will." He said it simply. Not as a threat. As information. The office was quiet except for the small sounds of the instruments on their spindles and the distant sound of the castle settling around them in its old, attentive way. Dumbledore looked at him. Really looked, the way he perhaps hadn't quite done before, not at Harry the resource or Harry the plan, but at the actual person sitting across from him in the chair. Yes, he said, finally. All right. He laced his fingers together on the desk. I'll tell you what I know. All of it. It will take some time. I've got time, Harry said. And McGonagall, who had been still and silent in her chair, reached into her pocket, produced a small tin of shortbread that had absolutely no business being in a serious meeting, and placed it on the desk between them with a precise little click that somehow managed to be the most definitive sound in the room. Then we'd best be comfortable, she said. Chapter 3, The Library and the Mirror. 3 days after the sorting, Hogwarts had reached a state of equilibrium that resembled normal the way a river resembles its pre-flood course, same general shape, different temperature, different pressure, and if you put your hand in you'd know immediately something had changed. Harry had settled into a rhythm. Breakfast, classes, library, dinner, common room, repeat, with the variation being the specific interesting thing that happened in each phase, because something interesting happened in every phase without exception. The castle was awake around him constantly now, not aggressively but persistently, like a very old dog that had decided you were worth following. Staircases configured themselves helpfully. Doors opened a half-second early. Twice, rooms he hadn't known existed had made themselves visible, a flash of a doorway where there'd been solid wall, gone again before he could properly look. He didn't hide any of it. He just didn't hold press conferences about it either. The distinction, as Flitwick had said, was strategy. Hermione had claimed a table in the back corner of the library within 4 hours of being allowed into it and had defended that claim with the same focused territorial energy she applied to everything. By Thursday morning it had accumulated enough books to be architecturally significant, and Madame Pants had stopped asking whose they were and simply routed other students around them the way you route traffic around a permanent installation. Ron had made peace with the library through a negotiation that involved him contributing sandwiches from dinner, Hermione tolerating his commentary on the things she was reading, and both of them understanding that his contributions to research were going to come through asking questions nobody else thought to ask rather than through sitting quietly with a quill, which he was constitutionally incapable of. This was where they were on Thursday evening when Hermione found it. Harry, she said, and the quality of her voice, very flat, very controlled, the voice she used when something had surprised her badly enough that she was compressing the reaction, made both Harry and Ron look up immediately. She turned the book around so they could see it. It was a large volume, old enough that its cover had gone the color of dried mud, with the title pressed into it in letters that had lost most of their gilt, Magisteria Arcana, A History of Exceptional Magical Capacity, 500-1800. She had it open to a page roughly 2/3 through, and the page had a diagram, a circular diagram showing concentric rings, which Harry recognized immediately as a representation of a magical core and the various structures that could be placed around or within it. The text below the diagram was in a dense old-fashioned print that required squinting, but the heading above it was clear enough. On the practice of custodial restriction, its applications, legalities, and the question of consent. Custodial restriction, Hermione said, with precision. Not just restriction. Custodial. That's a specific legal subtype. It was used for individuals deemed, listen. She pulled the book back and read aloud, her voice doing the thing it did when she was reading something that was making her furious while she read it. Custodial restriction differs from standard core limitation in its stated purpose, where limitation is employed for punitive or protective measures in the short term. Custodial restriction is a long-term instrument applied to individuals whose magical capacity is judged, by a custodial authority, to present a danger to the wider magical community or whose power is deemed to require supervised development before unrestricted access is granted. She stopped. Supervised development. That's the language they used. Supervised. As if you're a building project, Ron said. It gets worse. She found the next paragraph. The custodial authority assumes full legal responsibility for the restricted individual's magical education and development, and holds binding authority over the timeline and method of restriction removal, which shall occur only upon the authority's satisfaction that the individual has demonstrated sufficient. She closed the book, because she apparently couldn't finish the sentence without stopping to breathe. Sufficient maturity and stability of character. The library was quiet around them, Madame Pants a distant presence somewhere near the front. So whoever put the restriction on me, Harry said slowly, legally had to be satisfied that I was mature and stable enough before they removed it. Which is why there was no timeline, Hermione said. Dumbledore told you there was no timeline. Because legally, under custodial restriction, he determined the timeline. He had binding authority over when you got your own magic back. Until Fawkes, Ron said. Until Fawkes. She pushed the book across to Harry. There's more. There's a section on what happens when custodial restriction is removed by an unauthorized party. Which is apparently what Fawkes technically is, legally. An unauthorized party. Harry read. The section was dense but the core of it was clear enough. Unauthorized removal of custodial restriction triggered what the text called a reversion event, a full restoration of the individual's core to its unrestricted state, with all records of the restriction becoming automatically public to any institution with a legal interest in the individual. Which was why the Gringotts letter had arrived. Why the Wisengamot letter had arrived. The unsealing wasn't just magical, it was legal, and it had gone everywhere simultaneously the moment Fawkes had burned the last block. Fawkes knew, Harry said. Sorry. Hermione looked at him. Fawkes knew that removing them publicly, in front of 600 witnesses, would trigger the reversion event and make it automatic and irreversible and officially documented. He set the book down. He didn't just free me. He made it impossible for anyone to put them back or pretend it hadn't happened. He made it legal. Ron was looking at Harry with an expression of careful assessment. Smart bird. Incredibly smart bird. Harry was quiet for a moment. Which means he'd thought about it. He'd planned it. The first night, before any moves could be made, before I could be settled into whatever routine was planned for me. He chose the moment. Hermione was very still across the table. Harry. Dumbledore told you Fawkes has always had his own counsel. Yeah. How long do phoenixes live? Harry looked at her. A long time. A very long time. They're functionally immortal through the burning cycle. She met his eyes. Fawkes has known Dumbledore for decades. He's watched all of it. Whatever Dumbledore has been planning for you, whatever the shape of it, Fawkes has been there for all of it. And he disagreed. He's been disagreeing for, we don't know how long. And on the first possible night, the first moment you were within reach, he acted. The weight of this sat on the table between them alongside the old book and Ron's abandoned charms essay. I'd like to meet him properly, Harry said. I think, Hermione said carefully, that he'll come when he's ready. She was right, as she fairly often was. Harry set it aside, filed it in the way he was getting very good at filing things, not forgetting, not acting prematurely, but holding them in the right place until they were needed. What else? He said. She pulled 3 more books toward her. There's a section in this one. She opened a narrower volume with a cracked spine. Theoretical Frameworks in Ambient Magical Expression, which is about ambient casters specifically. Flitwick's term. She found the page. The documented ambient casters, there are 23 in recorded history, going back to before Hogwarts, all of them manifest what the author calls resonance phenomena. Which is essentially the castle noticing you, but wider. Objects in their vicinity respond to their emotional and intentional states without deliberate casting. Environmental magic, like the enchantments in this building, becomes sympathetic to them over time. The longer an ambient caster is in proximity to a structure with embedded enchantments, the more the structure begins to, she searched for the word. Align. The castle is aligning with me, Harry said. It's been doing it since the morning after the sorting. The trajectory suggests it'll be significantly more integrated by, she checked the chart in the book. A month? 6 weeks? What does integrated mean in practice? I think, she said slowly, it means the castle treats you the way it treats the headmaster. As an authority figure whose needs the enchantments accommodate. Ron looked at the ceiling of the library, the high, stone ceiling with its enchanted lanterns. So the castle's going to just, do what you want? Not automatically. Not like a tool. Hermione was reading ahead as she spoke. More like, a collaborator. It would still have its own, its enchantments have their own logic. But it would prioritize you. Right, Ron said slowly. So when you wanted to get into the restricted section, Ron, Hermione said sharply. I'm just noting, we are not using the castle's cooperative relationship with Harry to access restricted materials through unauthorized means. She paused. We will access restricted materials through a note from McGonagall, which I have already requested. Ron and Harry exchanged a look. You've already requested it, Harry said. Yesterday. After Transfiguration. She said she'd think about it. Hermione smoothed her parchment. I think she'll say yes. I explained what we were researching and why, and I think she has a personal investment in the answers. She was right about that too. The note arrived at breakfast Friday morning, a small piece of parchment folded precisely and delivered by McGonagall's own hand rather than an owl, which meant she'd decided overnight and felt the matter was worth direct delivery. It authorized Harry, Hermione Granger, and Ronald Weasley. Ron looked briefly affronted at being listed third, access to a specified list of restricted texts related to core theory, restriction practices, and historical exceptional ability documentation. It was a remarkably specific list. McGonagall had done her own research. They spent Friday evening in the restricted section, which smelled of old magic and preservative charms and had a quality to it, a heaviness in the air, like the books were breathing. That was presumably what prevented first-years from spending recreational time there. Harry found it interesting rather than oppressive, the way you find a very old church interesting, the accumulated weight of things that mattered. The books they needed were not in the restricted section by accident. 3 of them had sections marked, not recently marked, old marks, annotations in handwriting Harry didn't recognize, that dealt with magical core theory in ways that went significantly past the standard curriculum. One had a margin note, decades old, in handwriting that slanted sharply to the right. The restriction argument relies on a fundamental misclassification. These are not modifications. They are cages. Harry photographed this with his memory. The handwriting didn't match Dumbledore's, which he'd seen in the letter delivered after his first Transfiguration lesson. It didn't match McGonagall's precise vertical script either. He'd ask her, he decided. Later. What the books collectively established, Hermione synthesizing rapidly, Ron asking the sharp sideways questions that kept forcing her to explain things from different angles, Harry reading the parts that felt most relevant, was a picture more complex than the one they had. Custodial restriction was, in theory, a protective measure for children of exceptional ability. In practice, it had been used 17 times in documented history, and in 9 of those cases the restrictions had never been removed. The individuals in those 9 cases had lived their entire lives operating below their actual capacity, unaware of what had been taken from them, and in 4 of those cases the custodial authority had been a family member motivated not by protection but by fear. One case, a young woman in 1634, had involved a custodial authority who had used her restricted magical output as a justification for keeping her in what the text politely called supervised residence for 30 years. That's imprisonment, Ron said flatly. Yes, Hermione said. And this was legal. Until 1702. And then they made it illegal but kept the existing restrictions in place. Hermione looked at him. The law didn't have a retroactive provision. Ron breathed out steadily. Brilliant system. The 9 who were never restored, Harry said. He'd been looking at the page with the case histories. What happened to them? Hermione took the book and read. 3 died young, magical burnout, the text says, which doesn't make sense for someone who's restricted. They should have had less strain, not more, but the notes suggest that a core of sufficient magnitude doesn't respond well to restriction over a long period. It becomes, she frowned. It says self-consuming. Like a fire with insufficient fuel burning the container instead. The room was very quiet. So 34 blocks on a core like mine, Harry said, left for long enough. I don't know the timeline. I don't know enough about the specifics of your core's magnitude. She looked at him directly. But I think Fawkes may have had reasons beyond the legal ones. Harry sat with this. The cold word contained was still in its file, but now the file had more in it, a fuller picture, more dimensions, some of them darker than the initial version. He didn't rage about it. He didn't push it away. He held it steadily and looked at it, the way you look at something you need to understand before you can do anything useful about it. What do we know about Voldemort? He said. It was not a question, it was a direction of inquiry, and both of them adjusted accordingly. From here, from these books. Not the public story. The actual one. This took them until Madame Pants came to tell them the library was closing, which happened at 9 o'clock, and they were all three so deep in it by then that she had to say it twice. They walked back through the castle in the particular companionable silence of people who have learned a great deal at the same time and need to process it. The corridors were mostly empty, curfew was 10, which they hadn't breached, and the few students they passed had the glazed look of people going between the library and the common rooms on the established routes that everyone used. Harry wasn't on the established route. He'd been navigating intuitively for 4 days, following what he could feel the castle offering, and the route he took was faster and more interesting than the standard one, involving a staircase no one seemed to use and a corridor on the 3rd floor that the castle clearly preferred he take tonight. He stopped. Ron, following, nearly walked into him. What? Harry was looking at a door. It was an ordinary door, or it was doing a very good impression of an ordinary door, set into the corridor wall between 2 portraits of sleeping admirals. It had the quality of something that had not been used in some time but was not locked, and the castle was, it was the wrong word, but the closest one, pointing at it. I've walked past this corridor 3 times, Hermione said from behind Ron. There's never been a door there. It wasn't there before, Harry agreed. It is now. Ron looked at it. Should we? Harry was already opening it. The room inside was not large and not dramatic. It was stone-floored and high-ceilinged, with 2 windows that looked out onto the grounds, and it was mostly empty except for one object, a tall mirror, framed in ornate gold, with writing across the top in a script that Harry recognized as a cipher, letters arranged to look decorative that were actually a sentence, which he'd read about in Hogwarts, a history and now, looking at it, could parse. I show not your face but your heart's desire. He walked toward it. He was not afraid of it, which was perhaps why it worked on him differently than it might have. Fear was a kind of anticipation, a preloading of expectation, and expectation shaped what you saw in something like this. He walked toward it with the kind of open curiosity that comes from not knowing what you want badly enough to have it dominate everything, and he stood in front of it and looked. He saw himself. Just himself, at first, the same untidy hair, the same round glasses, the same green eyes that everyone seemed to feel the need to comment on because they belonged to his mother. The same slight frame. But the version of him in the mirror was standing differently. Not performing anything, not braced against anything, just standing the way you stand when you're completely, genuinely comfortable in your own body, and in his hands he held something Harry couldn't immediately identify, and around him were people. His parents, he knew them from photographs, James and Lily Potter, both young and vivid and real in a way photographs never quite managed, but also Ron, grinning, and Hermione with a book under her arm, and other people he didn't know yet, faces that were warm and familiar in the dream logic of the mirror, and behind all of them the castle, but different, the castle with its lights burning at the particular brightness they'd burned since the sorting. He stood there for about a minute. Then he stepped back. What do you see? Hermione asked. She was standing at his shoulder, having approached without him noticing, which told him he'd been more absorbed than he'd realized. He considered lying. He considered the edited version. He said, instead, my parents. And people I haven't met yet. And the castle the way it feels now. He paused. And myself standing normally. Hermione looked at the mirror. He watched her face as she looked, the rapid processing behind her eyes, and then something shifted, something that was not the academic hunger but something more private, and she looked away first. I see something I want, she said quietly. Which is the point of it? She was quiet for a moment. I looked in this mirror. What did you see? She shook her head. Not refusing, just setting it aside, which he respected. The important thing is, it's called the Mirror of Erist. It shows the deepest desire of whoever looks into it. Dumbledore wrote about it, there's a reference in a theoretical paper he published in 1967. He said it was the most dangerous magical object in the school because it could trap a person in their own longing indefinitely. She looked at Harry. He moved it to a secure location in 1943 and I don't know how it ended up here. I do, Harry said. She looked at him. The castle put it here. Tonight. He looked at the mirror again. For me. Ron, who had not approached the mirror and was looking at it from a careful distance near the door, said, why? Harry thought about it. The castle was old and its enchantments were complex and he didn't yet have the vocabulary for what was happening between him and the stones and the magic in them, but he could feel it the way you can feel a current in water even when you can't see it. I think it wanted me to see that, he said. Specifically. What I saw. What's in your hands? Ron said. He'd been watching Harry's face while Harry looked in the mirror. In what you saw. You were holding something. Harry looked at him. Ron was perceptive in a way that he occasionally forgot to be, in the same way gifted musicians occasionally forgot they were playing. I don't know yet, Harry said honestly. I couldn't tell. Ron nodded, accepting this. We should probably go. Curfew. But Harry looked at the mirror one more time before they left. Not at the image, at the object itself, the gold frame, the cipher text, the depth of the glass that seemed to go further back than the room's wall should have allowed. Something Hermione had said snagged at him. Dumbledore moved it to a secure location in 1943. It was here now. The castle had decided to show it to him. He thought about what that meant, not the mirror's content, but the act of being shown it. A test, maybe. Or a gift. Or both. The castle's enchantments were not simple and they were not random, and they were, if Hermione's research was right, becoming increasingly sympathetic to him. Maybe the castle was trying to tell him something about what mattered. Maybe it was trying to tell him to look at what he wanted, clearly, without the managed story that other people kept trying to write around him, so that he'd know the difference. He could work with that. They went back to the common room, which was warm and firelit and full of the comfortable noise of people existing in proximity, and Harry sat in an armchair and thought about mirrors and phoenixes and the cold academic language of restriction documents until his thoughts went quiet and the fire went to embers and Ron fell asleep on the sofa with his feet hanging off the arm. He was not surprised, the next day, to find a note on his bedside table. He was somewhat surprised by who it was from. The parchment was heavy, cream-colored, and the handwriting was the elegant script from the silver-sealed letter Hermione had set aside on the first morning. Mr. Potter, I imagine you've had time to settle in now, and I imagine you've been doing exactly what I'd expect someone of your particular circumstances to do, reading extensively, asking questions people would rather not answer, and making the castle somewhat more interesting than it's been in some time. I'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. Not a summons. An invitation. I think we may have something useful to discuss, you and I. The greenhouse on the east side of the grounds, Saturday morning, if you're willing. Not Senior. Harry read this twice, then handed it to Hermione at breakfast. She read it. Read it again. Set it down with a careful precision. Theodore Knott's father, she said. He's currently on the Wisengamot. He was listed in several Death Eater trials as a witness for the prosecution, not a defendant. He testified against 3 people. She paused. He's also one of the signatories on the ministry letter you received Monday. He's on the committee investigating my restriction. Yes. And he wants to meet privately first. Yes. She met Harry's eyes. It could be completely straightforward. He may genuinely have useful information from the Wisengamot's perspective. Or, Ron said, eating his toast. Or it's a more complicated kind of conversation, Hermione finished. Harry looked at the letter. The handwriting was not threatening, it was precise, controlled, the handwriting of someone who said exactly what they meant because imprecision had cost them something once. Not a summons. An invitation. That distinction mattered to someone. I'll go, Harry said. Harry, Hermione, I'm not going to learn anything by only talking to people who've already decided to be on my side. He folded the letter. Ron, you want to find out where the East Greenhouse is? Already know, Ron said, with the casual expertise of someone who'd spent a week mapping the grounds. It's the one Sprout doesn't use anymore. Been empty since the venomous tentacula incident of '88, according to Fred and George. Of course you've talked to Fred and George about the greenhouses, Hermione said. They're very informative. Saturday morning was grey and cool, the kind of morning that smelled of coming rain and cut grass, and Harry walked to the East Greenhouse with his hands in his pockets and his wand in his sleeve. He'd taken to carrying it there, the way he'd read Auror sometimes did, not because he expected to need it but because accessibility wasn't paranoia, it was practicality. The greenhouse was empty of plants but not of light, the glass panels filtered the grey morning into something warmer, and the smell of old soil and something faintly floral lingered. The man waiting inside was thin and upright in the way of someone who had maintained posture as a discipline for decades, with grey at his temples and dark eyes that assessed Harry the moment he came through the door with the specific efficiency of someone who had spent a long time assessing things. Mr. Potter, he said. Thank you for coming. Mr. Knott, Harry said. He didn't sit, there were 2 garden stools near the far wall, and Knott was standing, so Harry stood. What did you want to discuss? Knott looked at him with what Harry classified as, approval, maybe. Or recognition of something. Direct, he said. Good. He clasped his hands behind his back. I was at the sorting. My son Theodore is a first-year, Slytherin, you may not have, yes, you've likely noticed him. He notices things. A pause. I watched what happened. I've since reviewed the magical event documentation. And I'm on the committee that will be investigating the restriction, as you know. Yes. What I want to tell you, privately, before formal proceedings, is this. He held Harry's gaze steadily, and his voice had the quality of someone delivering precise technical information rather than performing an opinion. The restriction placed on you is not unique in ministry records. There are 4 other documented cases of custodial restriction placed post-1945. In 2 of those cases, the subjects do not know. They are adults currently, and they do not know. He paused to let this land. The committee's investigation into your restriction will necessarily turn over documentation that could bring these cases to light. I want you to be aware of that before the inquiry formally opens, because the moment it does, your restriction becomes the beginning of a larger proceeding, and you will be, the name attached to it. Harry was quiet for a moment. You're telling me that what was done to me was done to other people. Is being done. Present tense, in 2 of the 4 cases. Who authorized them? Different authorities in each case. One is a family member. One is a ministry official acting without explicit legal authority, which is the more serious situation. He held Harry's gaze. And one of the 4, was authorized by the same custodial authority as yours. The greenhouse was very quiet. Rain had started on the glass panels, a soft percussion. Dumbledore, Harry said. Not didn't confirm or deny. He simply held Harry's gaze steadily, which was a form of confirmation. What I want from you, Mr. Potter, is not opposition to the headmaster, not a public conflict that becomes a political event, and not a crusade. His voice was careful. What I want is your willingness to give formal testimony to the committee about the nature of what was done to you, and your permission for the documentation in your Gringotts file to be subpoenaed, which requires your consent as the file holder. He paused. With those two things, the committee can do the rest. The other cases can be identified and addressed. Without them, we have a Phoenix event and a file Gringotts won't release and an investigation that dies in its first session. Harry looked at him. Why are you doing this? Nott was quiet for a moment, and the quality of the quiet was different, less controlled, something more personal underneath. Because my son is 11 years old and starting his education, and the world he's starting it in has a system that can put 34 blocks on a child's magic and file the paperwork and consider it managed. He held Harry's eyes. I spent a long time in a world that considered things managed that were not managed. I'm finding I'm less comfortable with it than I used to be. Harry believed him. Not blindly, he filed the complexity of the man, the Death Eater adjacent history, the precise political positioning, but the thing underneath what Nott was saying had the grain of something true in it, and Harry had learned to feel the difference. All right, Harry said. Tell me what you need from me formally and I'll decide about each piece. I'm not giving a blanket agreement to anything. Nott's expression shifted, the approval again, more definite. Sensible. Also, the other two cases. The adults who don't know. Harry held his gaze. Someone needs to tell them. The committee will, tell them first. Before any proceedings. Give them the same courtesy of knowing before it becomes a public thing. He kept his voice level. Nobody should find out their own life in a formal inquiry. Nott was quiet for a moment. Agreed, he said. Yes. Agreed. They talked for another 20 minutes, specific and technical, and Harry listened more than he spoke and asked precise questions when he spoke, and by the time the rain had thickened to something earnest on the greenhouse glass he had a clearer picture of what the next several weeks were likely to look like politically, which was useful. He was walking back to the castle, rain damp and thinking, when the warmth arrived. Not weather warmth. The specific warmth that belonged to a specific presence, heat in the air like a fireplace, like something burning at a controlled and patient temperature. He stopped and looked up. Fawkes was perched on a stone buttress 20 feet above him, barely visible in the rain, his plumage darkened to ember and mahogany by the wet. He was looking at Harry with those volcanic eyes. Harry looked back. I've got questions, he said, standing in the rain. Fawkes tilted his head in the way that meant obviously. The other cases. Did you know about them? A sound, not the shattering note, not the full song, something conversational and low. That's a yes. Harry stood with the rain on his shoulders. Can you tell me if there's anyone in this school right now who's a direct threat? Not hypothetically. Actually. The sound that came back was different. Harder at the edges. Okay, Harry said. Okay. I know about Quirrell. Dumbledore told me on Tuesday. He paused. Do you know what's behind the third-floor corridor? Fawkes closed his eyes. Opened them. The Philosopher's Stone, Harry said, partly as a check. He'd worked it out from the hints Dumbledore had dropped in the Tuesday meeting, from Hagrid's nervousness on his birthday, from the newspaper clipping about the Gringotts break-in. Someone's trying to get it. And they're already in the school. Fawkes spread his wings, a brief, wide gesture, and closed them again. Right. Harry wiped rain off his glasses. Are you going to help me when it matters? The Phoenix looked at him for a long moment. Then he made the sound that Harry was beginning to understand meant something like I already am. Fair enough, Harry said. He went inside. Found Ron and Hermione in the common room, both of them looking up when he came in dripping and sat down in front of the fire without preamble. Not wants my testimony, he said. And my Gringotts file. He's investigating the restriction, there are other people affected. At least 4 other cases, 2 of them ongoing. Hermione closed her book. Ron put down his exploding snap cards. Dumbledore's involved in more than one, Harry continued. I think at least 1 other case. Not didn't say it outright but, he said it. He stretched his feet toward the fire. And I talked to Fawkes outside. What did he say? Hermione asked. He confirmed Quirrell's a threat. And that whatever's under the 3rd floor is what the threat's after. Harry looked at the fire. The Philosopher's Stone. I told Dumbledore I'd worked it out on Tuesday and he didn't deny it. Ron was very quiet for a moment. So there's a stone of immortality in the school and a possessed professor who wants to steal it. Yes. And Dumbledore knows. He set up the protections. Multiple of them, apparently. He said on Tuesday that he considers the protection sufficient, and when I asked him what he'd do if they weren't he said, Harry paused, remembering the specific quality of Dumbledore's expression, he said he believed the protections would hold because whoever tried to get through them would have to be sufficiently motivated to face each one, and he believed the final protection in particular to be, as he put it, unbeatable. Hermione frowned. What's the final protection? He didn't say. Which means it involves him directly. Or, his design of something very specific. Harry was quiet. I think he's expecting me to get involved. I think some part of the protection is designed around, me being the one who ends up facing Quirrell. Ron blinked. He built you into his trap. I think so. Harry said it without particular anger. It was information, not outrage. Which means I need to decide what I do with it. You could just not go, Ron offered. Someone's being possessed. Whatever Voldemort currently is, he's living in Quirrell, feeding on him. Harry looked at the fire. I'm not going to just not go. Hermione had the expression of someone rapidly processing several things and reaching a conclusion they find simultaneously correct and alarming. You want to go on your own terms. I want to go when I choose to, not when the trap closes. He looked at her. Which means we need to understand the protections before the trap closes. Ron looked at both of them. When you say we, I mean both of you, Harry said. Entirely your choice. I'm not, obviously I'm in, Ron said, as if this was the least interesting part of the conversation. Hermione had already opened a different book. I need to find out what the protection layers are. If I can get a list of the professors involved, she was already writing. McGonagall has a section. I know Quirrell has one, which is ironic, and Flitwick likely, Snape, Harry said. She looked up. Snape has a protection layer. I'd bet on it. Harry thought about the potions master's particular way of assessing him, the specific quality of attention that was something other than what it appeared. I don't know where he stands on all of this. But he's in it somehow. Hermione chewed her quill. He was a Death Eater. Turned informant. Dumbledore trusts him. Dumbledore trusts a lot of people in ways that are about his plans as much as about them, Harry said. Ron snorted. Yeah. Harry leaned back in the armchair. Outside the common room windows, the rain had settled into the steady grey permanence of an English autumn, making its intentions clear. The fire crackled. Around them, other Gryffindors moved through the room in their Saturday patterns, some heading to the pitch for informal Quidditch practice, some playing games, a pair of third years having an argument about something that involved a very animated chart. He thought about the mirror. About what he'd seen, the people around him, the castle burning bright, himself standing without weight. He thought about the thing in his hands in the reflection. The thing he hadn't been able to identify. He thought he might be starting to understand what it was. Not a wand. Not a book. Not a weapon of any kind. A choice. His own, made clearly, held openly, not managed by anyone else's hand. He had no idea yet what the specific choice would be. But the mirror had shown him the version of himself that made it, and that version was standing like someone who knew exactly how much space they were allowed to take up. He was working on that. The rain came down. The fire burned. Hermione filled 3 pages of notes with the ferocious efficiency of someone who had decided that the universe would be thoroughly documented whether it liked it or not, and Ron fell asleep again, this time in a chair, which was at least a different piece of furniture than yesterday. Harry sat in the warmth and thought about phoenixes and mirrors and 34 blocks and the particular weight of knowing what was coming before it came, which was not the same weight as being afraid. It was the weight of being ready. Chapter 4, The Troll, rewritten. Halloween arrived at Hogwarts the way it always did, dramatically, with more candles than strictly necessary and a menu that leaned aggressively into the occasion. By the time Harry, Ron, and Hermione made it to the Great Hall for the feast, the pumpkins had been carved into things that moved and the ceiling had gone full autumn storm, lightning flickering in the enchanted clouds while actual warmth held steady below. It was, objectively, impressive stagecraft. Harry sat down and helped himself to roast chicken and thought about Quirrell. He'd been thinking about Quirrell for 2 weeks with increasing precision. The man was unraveling in small, consistent ways. The stammer had begun to slip at the edges, appearing and disappearing with a rhythm that corresponded less to nerves and more to whatever was sharing his skull, asserting itself at inconvenient moments. His turban had been rewound 3 times in defense class this week alone. He'd stopped eating much at meals, which Harry had noticed because he'd made a habit of watching the high table with the specific attention you gave to something that was both dangerous and deteriorating. Dumbledore had noticed too. Harry was certain of it. The headmaster watched Quirrell with the expression of a chess player watching a piece that is technically still in play but whose moves have become predictable. What Harry found more interesting than Quirrell's deterioration was the pattern underneath it. Voldemort, working through Quirrell, was not making random moves. He was methodical. Harry had spent enough time in Dumbledore's confidence now to understand that the protections under the 3rd floor had been probed twice already, and both probings had been careful, information-gathering exercises rather than genuine attempts. Voldemort was mapping the obstacles before he committed. Smart, Harry thought, and not for the first time. Terrifying, but smart. Across the table, Ron was having a passionate argument with Seamus Finnegan about whether the Chudley Cannons had any realistic prospect for the season, which was the kind of argument that was mostly about loyalty and only superficially about evidence. Neville was eating with the focused relief of someone who'd had a good week. Herbology had turned out to be where his genuine ability lived, and Professor Sprout had said something specific and kind to him on Thursday that Harry had watched change the quality of Neville's posture for the rest of the day. Hermione was not at the table. Harry had assumed she was late. Then the feast got properly underway and she still wasn't there, and he did a quick mental accounting of the last time he'd seen her, lunchtime, sitting across from him reading, with the specific preoccupied quality she had when something she'd read was bothering her and she hadn't worked out why yet. He'd asked and she'd said it was nothing and he'd known it wasn't nothing, but he'd also known she'd tell him when she'd figured it out. He looked around the Great Hall. She wasn't at any of the other tables. She wasn't near the doors. Ron, he said. Ron was mid-argument. Statistically the keeper situation alone should, he read Harry's expression. What? Have you seen Hermione since lunch? Ron's argument face became a different face, quicker. He scanned the hall. No. I thought she was, no. He straightened. She's not here. No. Where would she? Ron stopped. The library? Maybe. But Harry was already thinking about the way Hermione looked when something was bothering her, and the thing that had been bothering her since Wednesday, which was the troll protection layer. She'd found a reference to it. One of the protection layers beneath the 3rd floor corridor involved a mountain troll, which had stopped being an abstract fact when she'd read the full documentation on how the layer was activated. A specific condition. A specific trigger. She'd been quiet about it since Wednesday. Harry pushed his chair back. Harry, Ron was already pushing his back too. They were halfway to the doors when the doors opened themselves. Not the smooth, castle-accommodating Harry opening that he was used to, a violent opening, both doors simultaneously, slamming against the walls with a crack that stopped conversations at 3 tables. Professor Quirrell ran through them. He ran the way people run when the thing they're most afraid of has stopped being theoretical. His turban was askew again, his robes disheveled, and he was moving with none of his usual performance of himself, the stammer, the nervous disposition, all of it stripped away by what was on his face, which was a genuine and specific terror that Harry recognized, with cold clarity, as not belonging to Quirrell at all. Something was enjoying this. Troll! Quirrell shouted, and his voice broke on it in a way that might have been the stammer but wasn't. In the dungeons. Thought you ought to know. He fainted. The great hall became noise. Dumbledore was on his feet immediately, wand out, voice cutting through the chaos with the efficient authority of someone who had managed catastrophes before and found panic to be the least useful response to them. Prefects were organized. Houses were directed. The machinery of an institution managing an emergency engaged with practiced speed. Harry was already through a side door before the Gryffindors had finished getting up from the table. Ron caught up to him in the corridor, breathing hard. "She's in the girls' bathroom," he said, low and quick. "3rd floor, near the defense classroom. She was upset at lunch. I heard from Lavender that she'd been crying in there since this afternoon." Harry stopped. Looked at him. "How did you know she was upset at lunch?" "Because she was reading the same page for 20 minutes and not turning it," Ron said, with the simple honesty of someone who'd grown up watching people carefully because you had to in a house with 5 brothers. "And she eats faster when she's bothered." "She didn't eat much." He shrugged. "I should have said something." "Yeah," Harry said. "Me too." He was already moving. 3rd floor. "Come on." The corridor outside the Great Hall was filling with students being marshaled toward their dormitories by prefects and teachers, and moving against the current was not difficult exactly. Harry moved through it with the ease that had become natural to him over the past weeks, not forcing anything, just finding the path, the way you find a current in a river if you stop fighting the water. Ron followed in his wake with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who had learned that following Harry was faster than arguing with him. The staircases were not obliging tonight. The castle was tense, Harry could feel it, the way he could always feel it now, but amplified, the magic in the stones agitated by something that should not be in the building, something that the enchantments didn't know how to categorize. The troll was in the dungeons, Quirrell had said, which meant the girls' bathroom on the 3rd floor was, not safe, but safer. In theory. In theory. They heard it before they reached the corridor. Not loud, at first, a sound like something very large moving in a space that wasn't designed for it, a low rhythmic percussion of enormous weight on stone, and beneath that a splintering sound that Harry's brain identified as wood and porcelain under impact before the rest of his mind had caught up to what that meant. "It's not in the dungeons," Ron said, flat. "No." They ran. The corridor at the top of the 3rd floor staircase had the specific quality of wrong that you felt before you understood it, a smell of something wild and animal and very large, a displacement in the air, the temperature 3 degrees lower than the rest of the castle. The door to the girls' bathroom at the end of the corridor was standing open, which it shouldn't have been, and from inside came the sound of something enormously satisfied with the destruction it was causing. Harry went through the door. The troll was approximately 12 feet tall and roughly as wide as a car, and it had found the bathroom in a way that suggested the bathroom had not meaningfully resisted. 3 cubicle walls were rubble. The sinks along one wall had been comprehensively destroyed. The thing smelled like something that had never in its life been cleaned and had strong feelings about the experience. It was currently raising a club the size of a mature tree trunk above a sink that was already destroyed, and beneath the debris from the first cubicle, partially visible, was Hermione. She was alive. She was conscious, Harry could see her moving, trying to pull herself further under the partial shelter of a broken wall section. She'd taken something across her shoulder, he thought, from the way she was moving. Not incapacitated. But pinned enough, and the troll was large enough, that the options available to her were very bad. She looked up and saw him. The expression on her face did several things in rapid succession: relief, assessment of the situation, and then something that was specifically directed at Harry, a look that said don't do anything stupid and also please do something. The troll raised the club. Harry didn't reach for his wand. He'd thought about this, theoretically, in the abstract way you think about things you're not sure you can do until the moment requires you to. Flitwick's independent study materials had included a section on what he called intentional ambient expression, essentially, wandless magic with direction and control rather than the reactive burst of undirected power. They'd worked on it 3 times a week. Harry had been, according to Flitwick, developing at a rate that Flitwick had described as unprecedented in the modern era, and then immediately reminded Harry that unprecedented was not the same as ready for combat application. He thought Flitwick had underestimated the motivating power of a 12-foot troll. He put his hand up, not a wand gesture, not a spell incantation, just the physical expression of a specific intention, and caught the club. Not with his hand. With what was behind his hand. The troll's arm stopped mid-swing as if it had met a wall, the club arrested in the air above Hermione's position, and the troll looked at the thing stopping it with an expression of genuine confusion that might have been funny under different circumstances. Then it pulled. The thing about a 12-foot mountain troll was that it was enormously, stupidly, brutally strong, and it had no concept of a fair fight because it had no concept of a fight at all in the human sense. It was pure force, no strategy, and when pure force met an obstacle it simply applied more force. The troll hauled at the club with the full leverage of its mass, and Harry felt the push of it, felt it genuinely, in a way that was not trivial, the sheer overwhelming physicality of it. He held. It took everything he had to hold it, and he was aware of this in the specific clear way that adrenaline clarifies things, but he held it. "Ron," he said, very steadily. "Get Hermione out." Ron was already moving. He crossed the bathroom in 5 strides, navigating the debris with the sure-footed pragmatism of someone who played Quidditch in all weather, dropped to one knee beside Hermione, and got his shoulder under her arm with a quick efficiency that meant he'd assessed where she was hurt before he reached her. "I've got you," he said, and she didn't argue, which told Harry she'd hurt her shoulder more than she'd shown. They were moving. Harry watched them in his peripheral vision and kept his attention on the troll, which had decided to try a different approach and was now attempting to raise the club by rotating its arm, which Harry adjusted for by redirecting the field he was holding. The troll snarled. Something in its limited intelligence was catching up to the fact that the small creature standing in front of it was the problem. It dropped the club and lunged. Harry stepped sideways and pushed, a direct application, not the broad field he'd been using to hold the club but something more specific and considerably more forceful, and the troll's lunge turned into an involuntary, very fast trip sideways that ended with 12 feet of mountain troll putting its head through the remaining intact section of the far wall with a crack that brought dust and plaster down from the ceiling. It sat down. It was not unconscious. But it was extremely confused, and its arm had gone through the wall up to the shoulder and it was finding that the wall's opinion of releasing it was no. Harry walked out of the bathroom. Ron and Hermione were in the corridor, Hermione on her feet, leaning on Ron's shoulder, her robes dusty and torn, her hair destroyed, and her expression doing the complicated thing it did when she had many feelings about the same situation. She was looking at Harry with something that was not quite the research specimen look and not quite the worried friend look but somewhere in its own category. "Your shoulder," Harry said. "It's not dislocated," she said, with the confidence of someone who'd checked. "Bruised. Badly, but I'm fine." She paused. The troll. Having a conversation with the wall. Harry looked at Ron. "Are you all right?" Ron was breathing hard and had dust in his hair, and his expression was doing the version of casual that meant he was working very hard not to show how his hands were shaking slightly. "Yeah. Grand." He looked back at the bathroom. You stopped the club." "With your hand." "Not with my hand." "With your hand." Ron looked at him with the expression of someone genuinely re-evaluating a previously held belief system. "Mate. That was, you just stopped a mountain troll mid-swing. I also walked it into a wall. You did. Yes. Both of those things. He breathed out. Yeah. They heard footsteps then, McGonagall's specific rapid stride, heels on stone with the quality of someone who was moving faster than they wanted to and angrier than they were going to show, and then Snape behind her with the soundless movement of someone who had been doing this longer, and Quirrell at the rear, pale and sweating and leaning on the wall as he walked. McGonagall came around the corner and stopped. She looked at Hermione, dust, torn robes, bad shoulder. She looked at Ron, dust, shaking hands he'd almost controlled. She looked at Harry, barely dusty, perfectly steady, standing in the corridor outside a bathroom from which could be heard the specific sounds of a 12-foot troll attempting to extract itself from a wall it had been introduced to at speed. She looked back at the bathroom door. Potter, she said, with precise control. What is in that bathroom? A mountain troll having some difficulty with the east wall, Harry said. It's contained. For now. McGonagall went through the door and came back in approximately 4 seconds. She pulled the door closed behind her with a click that was the architectural equivalent of a deep breath. Snape, she said. The troll. Snape went in. There were several sharp, precise spell sounds, and then the sounds of struggle ceased, and Snape came back out with the expression of someone who had done something that required no particular effort and found the lack of challenge more offensive than the obstacle. Stunned, he said. The Ministry will need to collect it. He looked at Harry with his usual dark, assessing attention, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way most people would have caught, but Harry was watching carefully and what he saw was not the calculation of threat assessed and neutralized, it was more like the filing of a significant data point. Quirrell was looking at Harry too, and this look was completely different. It was Quirrell's face and it was wearing Quirrell's expression of nervous anxiety, but something behind the eyes was not nervous at all. Something behind Quirrell's eyes was looking at Harry the way you look at something you've been thinking about for a long time and are finally seeing clearly, and the quality of that look was cold and interested and not remotely human. Harry looked directly back at it. The thing behind Quirrell's eyes, Voldemort, reduced and sharing a skull and furious about both conditions, flinched. Not visibly. Not in any way anyone else in the corridor could have observed. But Harry felt it, the flicker, the recoil, the quality of something that had been looking at him through Quirrell's eyes and had not expected to be looked at back in the way that Harry was looking. It withdrew. The eyes went back to Quirrell's ordinary frightened expression and Quirrell swayed and put his hand on the wall. My goodness, Quirrell said, in his stammer. How dreadful. Indeed, McGonagall said, giving him a look that was considerably more complex than the words warranted. She turned to the three of them. Miss Granger, Madame Pomfrey, immediately, for your shoulder. Mr. Weasley, Madame Pomfrey as well, she'll want to check you over. Her voice was the precise controlled version, the one that didn't show what it was containing. She looked at Harry last. You, Mr. Potter, will come with me. Am I in trouble? He asked, not because he thought so but because the answer would be interesting. You're 11 years old and you've just, no, she said, and there was something in the word that was not quite exasperation and not quite something else. You are not in trouble. Come. Her office was 2 floors up and smelled of Edinburgh and very strong tea and the specific combination of 100 years of lesson plans. She sat him down and poured 2 cups of tea without asking and pushed one across the desk to him and then sat behind it and looked at him for a long moment. Tell me exactly what happened, she said. Precisely and completely. He told her. He didn't edit it. He said, he'd noticed Hermione wasn't at the feast, he'd worked out where she was, he and Ron had gone to get her, the troll was there, he'd used ambient expression to arrest the troll's swing, redirected it into the wall. He said it in the flat accurate way he said important things, not boasting, not minimizing. McGonagall listened with her tea in her hand and her expression very still. When he finished she was quiet for a moment. The troll was not in the dungeons when Quirrell made his announcement, she said. No. It was already on the third floor. Which means the announcement was not a warning. She met his eyes. Someone moved the troll. As a distraction. As a way to clear the hall and the corridors, Harry agreed. So that whoever moved it could get to the third floor unobserved. The third floor, she said, and the words had weight. Yes. We contained it before whatever that attempt was could complete, she said. Apparently. He paused. Someone came back from the corridor before I left the feast, Professor. Before us, because the troll was already there. Someone moved the troll and then came back and made the announcement. Which means they were out of the hall, moved the troll, and then, Quirrell, she said. His timing was off. He was too specifically frightened. Whatever was on his face when he came in, Harry paused. The dungeon announcement was misdirection. The troll was already heading for the third floor and he needed everyone moving in the opposite direction. McGonagall set her tea down with a very precise click. She was quiet for a moment that had the quality of someone reaching a decision they'd been deferring. What do you know, she said, about the corridor on the third floor? Specifically. He looked at her steadily. As much as Dumbledore told me 2 weeks ago, which I suspect is more than you know he told me. Something flickered across her face. He told you about, all of it. The stone. The protections. The general shape of what's being attempted. He paused. Not the specific protections. He was cagey about the details. She stopped. Yes. He would be. She looked at Harry and he could see her doing the specific calculation of how much was safe to tell him, and then he could see her reach the decision that safe was the wrong metric. There are 7 protection layers. Each one designed by a different professor. They are progressive, you can only reach the next one by successfully navigating the one before it. The logic being that no single person is likely to have the skills to get through all 7. Unless, Harry said. Unless they've had the time and the access to prepare for each one. She looked at the desk. The troll was Professor Quirrell's contribution. Harry was quiet for a moment. He moved his own protection layer. To let himself through it, she said. Yes. If the logic of the system is that each professor designed their own challenge, then each professor presumably knows how to circumvent their own challenge. Her voice had a quality to it, a controlled fury, the kind that burned cold and precise. He designed a challenge he could simply walk past. How many of the other layers are set up the same way? She looked at him. I don't know. I designed mine to be genuinely impassable without specific knowledge I haven't shared with anyone. But I can't speak for the others. She paused. I should have, the system assumed integrity among its architects. That was a flaw in the system. Harry thought about this. About Voldemort mapping the obstacles. About the patience of something that had been dormant and diminished for 10 years and was now moving carefully through a design trap because it understood the trap better than some of the trap's architects. The stone needs to move, he said. McGonagall looked at him. Quirrell got stopped tonight because the troll ended up contained instead of distracting. That's not going to happen twice. The next attempt will be better planned. He met her eyes. The stone needs to not be there when the next attempt happens. That decision is not mine to make. I know. I'm not asking you to make it. He paused. I'm asking you to tell Dumbledore that I said it. Tonight. She held his gaze for a moment. And if he disagrees? Then I'll tell him myself. But you've been telling him things all term and having more effect than I would have expected, so. He picked up his tea, which had gone slightly cold. I thought the recommendation might land better from you. The corner of her mouth moved. Just briefly. Drink your tea, Mr. Potter. He drank it. She sent him back to the common room with 5 points to Gryffindor each for himself and Ron and Hermione, which she announced with the specific brisk reluctance of someone who is being fair against their instinct to give more, and with the instruction to get some sleep, which he filed under things that were good advice that he was unlikely to immediately follow. The common room was full when he got back. The troll situation had reached the rumor stage, which in a school of several hundred teenagers meant it had been comprehensively exaggerated, and 3 separate contradictory accounts were currently competing for dominance near the fire. He came in and the room went briefly and specifically quiet. He found Ron and Hermione in the corner by the window, Hermione with her arm in a sling that Madame Pomfrey had applied and a cup of something hot, Ron with his feet up on the coffee table with the elaborate casualness of someone who had recently been mildly heroic and was doing their best to pretend it was unremarkable. Harry sat down. "How's the shoulder?" 2 weeks, Hermione said, with the clipped frustration of someone who finds having an injury inconsiderate of their schedule. "Madame Pomfrey says if I'd had it looked at straight away it would have been 3 days with the right healing charm, but apparently the delay means," she stopped herself. "It's fine. I'm fine." She looked at him. "What did McGonagall say?" He told them. Both of them listened, Ron with his head tilted to one side in the way he listened when he was processing faster than he appeared to be, Hermione with her quill in her good hand out of habit even though she wasn't writing. When he got to the part about Quirrell moving his own protection layer, Ron said, very quietly, "That's actually kind of brilliant." "Awful, but brilliant." "The system trusted its architects," Hermione said. Yes. It's a significant flaw. The assumption of integrity made the whole structure vulnerable at 7 points. 6 points now, Harry said. "McGonagall's layer is different." Hermione nodded. "What else do we know about the other layers?" "Flitwick has one," Harry said. "And Sprout. I'm fairly sure Snape has one. He's been behaving in a way that suggests personal investment in whether the stone gets stolen." Ron looked interested. "Snape wants to steal it." "Snape wants to prevent it being stolen. I think." Harry paused. "He's been counter-monitoring Quirrell. I've watched him watching Quirrell in the corridor. He knows something's wrong." He thought about the conversation after potions on his first day, the specific words Snape had chosen. "There are people in this school who were Death Eaters." Snape had been warning him. About Quirrell, obliquely. "Then Snape's on the right side of this one," Ron said. "On this one," Harry agreed. Hermione had been quiet for a moment, her quill moving over an invisible page in the absent way it moved when she was writing in her head. "Harry," she said. "What you did in the bathroom." "Yeah." The ambient expression. "Flitwick's been working with you on it." "Yes." "You stopped a 12-foot troll mid-swing." "I did." She looked at him directly. "How hard was that?" He thought about giving her the version that made it sound manageable. He said instead, "Hard. If it had pulled at the club for another minute I don't know if I could have held it. I redirected rather than maintain the hold because redirecting was more efficient." She absorbed this. "So there's a limit. Everything has limits. But your limits are," she was searching for the word. "Further out than they were a month ago," he said. "And further out than most people's. But yes. There are limits." She looked at him for a moment with the non-specimen look, the person-looking-at-person look. "I was very scared," she said quietly. "In the bathroom. Before you came." He held her gaze. "I know. I was doing the calculations, what I had available, what I could do, and the options they weren't good." She paused. "And then you came through the door." "So did Ron." "Yes." She glanced at Ron, who was looking at the fire with carefully arranged casualness and very red ears. "Yes. Both of you." She straightened slightly. "I should have told someone where I was. I should have told someone I was upset about what I'd found. Instead I went to a bathroom and cried about it on Halloween like the scenario from a novel." Her voice had gone dry. I'm going to be more, I'm not going to do that again." "You're allowed to cry about things," Ron said, to the fire. My mum says, she cries at the radio sometimes. Doesn't mean she's not still the most capable person in any given building. Hermione stared at him. Ron continued looking at the fire with intense casualness. That's very nice, Ron, she said. Right. He cleared his throat. Anyway. Harry looked between them and felt the specific warmth again, the one that had nothing to do with Fawkes and everything to do with these two specific people in this specific corner, and the way the three of them fit together in a configuration he hadn't expected and couldn't have designed and was daily more grateful for. Tomorrow, he said, we start mapping the protection layers properly. We need to know what all 7 are, and we need to know how to get through them, and we need to plan for going through them in a hurry if we have to. Planning for going through them ourselves, Hermione said. Yes. The 7 protections designed to prevent anyone without professor-level ability from passing. She paused. Which most people our age would find impossible. Yes, Harry said again. Right, Hermione said, and opened the book she'd had under her good arm since Harry sat down, which was already bookmarked at 3 relevant sections because she'd started this process without them. Ron looked at her. At Harry. She already started, didn't she? She definitely already started, Harry said. I've been thinking about it since I could think clearly after Madame Pomfrey, Hermione said, not looking up from the book. Which was approximately 40 minutes ago. I've already identified 2 of the 7 based on what the professors have been teaching and what I know of their specialties. Flitwick's is almost certainly a charm-based challenge. Given his work on charms theory, the lock will be either an Alohomora-resistant system or something requiring specific vocal magic. She turned a page. Sprouts is almost certainly herbological, given that there's a trapdoor with something growing around it according to the 3rd floor corridor's maintenance records which I found in a filing system the castle let me into. She looked up. The castle let me access the maintenance records, by the way. Through a door in the library I hadn't noticed before. I think it was showing me something useful. Harry and Ron both looked at her. The castle, she said carefully, has been increasingly cooperative. Not just with Harry. I think his relationship with it has made it generally more attentive. To his people. She looked at Harry. I'm your people, apparently. You are, Harry said. The castle thinks so too. She looked slightly flustered by this and covered it with the book. Anyway. The maintenance records. Sprout's lair is Devil's Snare. Which we've just done in herbology, Ron said, sitting up. Light and heat. Exactly. She turned another page. I need to research the other 5. I have hypotheses for 3 of them. What did the maintenance records show about the 3rd floor overall? Harry asked. She hesitated. Hermione. There's a living thing there, she said. Before the 7 protections. A very large living thing, based on the space it's allocated in the records. Multi-specimen notation. She paused. I think there's a 3-headed dog. Ron's feet came off the coffee table. A3, someone put a 3-headed dog in the school. Hagrid, Harry said. They both looked at him. Hagrid, he said again. He mentioned on my birthday, he said he'd done Dumbledore a favor, moving something. He was very careful about it, but he was proud of it. The way he's proud of things that are dangerous that he thinks are charming. He paused. Fluffy. Sorry. Hermione said. Hagrid named it. The dog. He called it Fluffy. Harry's expression did something that was not quite a smile. He mentioned the name and immediately looked like he'd said something he shouldn't. Ron stared at him. Someone named a 3-headed dog Fluffy. Hagrid named a 3-headed dog Fluffy, yes. Ron put his head back against the chair and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a person cataloging the world's strangeness for future reference. Right. Fine. What stops a 3-headed dog? Presumably not just walking past it. Music, Harry said. They both looked at him again. I read about Cerberus in a mythology book once, he said. Greek mythology. Three-headed dog guarding the underworld, and the one thing that worked on it was music. Orpheus played a lyre. I think, if it's based on the same principle, an instrument, Hermione said, her quill beginning to move with serious intent. Something you'd have to play. Or, she stopped. Harry. Can you sing? He stared at her. That's not, are you? You're an ambient caster, she said, with the crisp efficiency of someone making a logical connection and following it. What you produce without a wand or a tool is an extension of your own magical self. If music is the key and you can produce sound with ambient magical resonance, the effect might be considerably more powerful than a regular instrument. He thought about this. About Fawkes' song in the Great Hall, the way it had hit the walls and come back amplified, the way it had filled everyone present with warmth. The way it had come from a magical creature's voice rather than an instrument. I don't know, he said honestly. We should find out, she said. Not tonight. But, before it matters, he agreed. Yes. The fire burned down. The common room gradually emptied as people went to bed in groups, the buzz of the troll evening settling into the exhaustion that followed adrenaline. Neville came and said goodnight with the specific hesitant warmth of someone who was hoping to be included and wasn't sure whether to ask. Harry said they'd see him at breakfast, and Neville went up looking pleased. Dean and Seamus offered collective congratulation in the form of enthusiastic and partially inaccurate compliments about the troll situation, which Harry accepted with good humor. By the time only the three of them were left in the corner by the window, the fire had gone to embers and the rain had stopped and the grounds outside were silver in the cloud-filtered moonlight. One more thing, Hermione said, and her voice had gone to the very specific quiet she used when something was important enough to be careful about. Yeah. Harry said. When you looked at Quirrell, in the corridor after. You did something. She was watching him carefully. I saw it, his expression changed. Something in him flinched. What did you do? Harry was quiet for a moment. I looked back. That's all. I looked at what was behind his eyes, he said. Not Quirrell. The other thing. I looked at it directly. She was quiet for a moment. And it flinched. Yes. Because you could see it. Because I could see it and wasn't afraid of it, he said. I think. The difference between being seen and being seen without fear is, it changes something. For whatever's doing the hiding. Ron was quiet and had been quiet for a while in a way that meant he was thinking rather than sleeping. What did it look like, he said. The other thing. What you saw behind his eyes. Harry looked at the embers. Old, he said. Very old, and very angry, and very diminished. Like something that used to be enormous and is now being held together by its own fury. He paused. It looked at me like I was a problem it hadn't solved yet. How did that feel? Ron asked. Harry thought about it honestly. About the cold quality of that red gaze through Quirrell's eyes, the ancient intelligence behind it, the barely contained rage. Fine, he said. It felt fine. I've been a problem other people hadn't solved for 11 years. He looked at the fire. I know what to do with that. The embers burned. Outside, the castle settled into its old stones in the particular way of something very large breathing very slowly, and the moonlight moved across the grounds in the long arcs of real, physical time, and inside the warm corner by the window 3 11-year-olds sat with the specific weighted silence of people who had looked at something enormous and decided to look back. Chapter 5, Fire Answers Fire. The first Quidditch match of the season was Gryffindor vs Slytherin, which the castle treated as a significant weather event regardless of what the actual sky was doing. By the time Harry came down to breakfast on match morning, the Great Hall had the buzzing, slightly unstable energy of a place where 400 opinions were being held simultaneously and most of them were about him. He'd been made Seeker 3 weeks into term. The circumstances had been, according to Oliver Wood, unprecedented, no first year had played in a century, and the rule existed for good reason, and Wood had still gone directly to McGonagall with approximately 17 minutes of prepared argument which he'd never gotten to deliver because she'd said yes before he finished his first sentence. Harry suspected the yes had less to do with Wood's argument and more to do with McGonagall having watched Harry catch a falling glass in the corridor the previous week without touching it, an incident she'd observed from 20 feet away and which she had not mentioned to anyone, apparently, except Wood. Harry genuinely loved flying. This had surprised him. He'd expected to be good at it, given what Flitwick kept carefully not saying about the extent of his ambient sensitivity, but good and loved were different things, and what he felt on a broomstick was the rare, clean feeling of a thing being exactly what it was supposed to be. The broom responded to him the way the castle did, the way his wand did, with an immediacy and a precision that felt like conversation rather than operation. He ate breakfast efficiently and ignored the staring, which by now he'd reduced to a background condition, like weather. Ron was building elaborate toast architecture and talking tactics, which was his version of nervous preparation, filling the air with words about something he actually understood very well so that there was no room in it for the less comfortable feelings. Harry let him talk and absorbed about 60% of it, which Ron seemed to find satisfactory. Hermione, whose sling had come off 3 days ago and whose shoulder was mostly healed, was reading and occasionally interjecting with observations that were statistically accurate and tactically irrelevant but which she felt needed to be said. Neville gave Harry a small ceramic frog at breakfast. "For luck," Neville said, going red. "My gran sends them. I have loads. She won't mind." Harry looked at the frog. It was glazed in a particularly determined shade of green and had the expression of something that had survived worse than this. "Thanks, Neville. You don't have to actually, I mean, it's not, I'm putting it in my pocket," Harry said, and did. Neville beamed and went back to his porridge, and Harry thought that Neville Longbottom was going to be quietly remarkable someday and that everyone currently underestimating him was going to find that embarrassing in retrospect. The Slytherin team came in while Harry was finishing his pumpkin juice, and Malfoy caught his eye across the length of the hall in the way Malfoy had started doing over the past weeks, deliberate, assessing, with none of the casual contempt he performed for the benefit of his table. When Malfoy was being watched by his peers he was one thing, when he and Harry were simply looking at each other across a room he was a noticeably different, more careful, more interesting thing. Harry nodded at him. Malfoy's expression flickered. Not returned, not rejected. Complicated. He looked away. Theodore Nott, 2 seats down from Malfoy, met Harry's eyes briefly and gave the smallest possible incline of his head, which was a Nott family gesture Harry had learned from his father's letter in the greenhouse. The Notts communicated precision, not warmth, but precision was its own form of courtesy. Harry nodded at him too and went to get his nimbus. The pitch was brilliant. That was the only word that worked. November in Scotland should not have been brilliant, it should have been grey and bitter and miserable in the specific way of Scottish November that makes you understand why people historically invented whiskey, but the morning had broken clear and sharp, the sky a blue so clean it looked manufactured, and the pitch in the middle distance glittered with frost that hadn't quite melted and probably wouldn't. Harry walked out of the changing rooms behind Wood and felt the cold air hit his face and felt the castle at his back and felt, running under everything, the particular quality of a day that was going to matter. He'd been having more of those. The feeling wasn't premonition exactly, he didn't see anything, didn't have specific information about events, it was more a shift in texture, the same way you could feel a storm coming hours before it arrived, not through any particular clairvoyance but through the accumulated information of pressure and temperature and the quality of the light. The day had that quality. He mounted the broom and rose into the cold air and thought, all right. Let's see what happens. The match started well. Gryffindor's chasers, Angelina, Katie, Alicia, moved with the practice coordination of a team who'd played together for 2 years and knew each other's rhythms, and Wood in the goalposts had the focused ferocity of someone who treated each match as a personal confrontation between himself and the opposing team's honor. Harry circled high above the action, watching the snitch's absence, watching everything else. The Slytherin Seeker was a 5th year named Flint's younger cousin, which meant nothing about her ability but did mean she'd been trained by someone with strong opinions about winning. She was aggressive in her positioning, not subtle, trying to crowd Harry away from the center of the pitch where search radius was best. He let her do it for about 4 minutes because the crowding told him things about where she thought the snitch was, and then he repositioned in about 2 seconds flat and she had to chase him, which reversed the strategic pressure entirely. He was aware, distantly, of the crowd. The sound of several hundred people watching something was a specific frequency, and it changed depending on what was happening below. A roar for the goals Wood was blocking, groans for the ones he wasn't, and underneath it a persistent, pitched attention that was focused on Harry specifically, the entire crowd tracking the Gryffindor seeker the way you track something that might move very suddenly. He didn't disappoint. At the 12-minute mark he saw it, the snitch, hovering 20 feet below him and 40 feet to the west, just inside the wind shadow of the eastern goalpost where the stillness would make it easier for it to maintain position. It was doing what snitches did, which was exist at the specific intersection of visible and hidden that made catching them a genuine challenge. He tucked. The Nimbus responded the way it always did, with the total mechanical commitment of something that understood what you were asking and had no reservations about delivering. The dive was steep and fast, and the crowd noise shifted to the particular quality of mass inhalation that Harry was starting to recognize as his personal theme music, and the Slytherin Seeker was behind him and then further behind him and the snitch was growing from a gold pinprick to a gold coin to a gold sphere and he reached out. Something happened to his broom. Not mechanically. Not physically. The Nimbus itself was fine, but it kicked, a sharp, lateral jolt, like a hand had pushed it sideways, and Harry corrected without thinking but the correction cost him trajectory and the snitch dipped and he had to pull up and the moment was gone. He circled back up, his hands very steady on the broom handle, and looked at the broom. He felt the enchantment on it. It wasn't there before, he knew it wasn't there before because he was sensitive enough now to feel the magic in everything around him and he'd been flying this broom for 3 weeks and he knew its magical signature the way you know a voice. Something had been added. A jinx, recent, probably within the last 20 minutes, designed to cause intermittent interference that would look like broom malfunction rather than deliberate sabotage. He looked at the stands. He was too high and too far to see faces clearly without, but he didn't need physical sight for this, not anymore, not with the kind of ambient sensitivity he'd been developing. He broadened his attention across the pitch and felt the crowd the way he felt the castle, as a collection of magical presences, each one distinct, and among them, there. In the staff section. The quality of focused magical intention, precise and cold, coming from someone who was maintaining an active enchantment with the concentration that left a trace he could follow. He followed it. The trace led to a dark figure in the staff section whose lips were moving in a barely visible murmur, whose eyes were fixed on Harry's broom with the complete attention of someone performing technical magic that required their full concentration. Severus Snape. Harry held this. He held the broom steady with his physical hands and held the information steady in his mind and examined it from every angle in the approximately 2 seconds he had before the Slytherin Seeker caught up to him and started the crowding maneuver again. Snape was maintaining an active enchantment directed at Harry's broom. Which could mean Snape had placed the jinx, in which case what Snape had told him after potions in week 1 was theater. Or it could mean Snape had detected the jinx and was maintaining a counter-enchantment, holding the jinx in check so that it couldn't do worse than the one jolt it had already managed. Harry thought about the cold, precise voice in the potions classroom. The specific vocabulary of someone who said exactly what they meant. Be aware. The way Snape watched Quirrell in corridors with the focused attention of counter-surveillance. The protection layer designed into the system beneath the 3rd floor. He made a decision. He extended his attention further and found Quirrell 4 rows from Snape in the stands, and the trace coming from Quirrell was different, diffuse, chaotic at its edges, the magical signature of something that was trying to maintain its shape against the resistance of the body it was occupying. The jinx had originated from Quirrell. Snape was holding it. Right, Harry thought. He let Snape hold it and went back to finding the snitch. It took another 7 minutes. The Slytherin Seeker was good, genuinely, not just aggressively, she had excellent eyes and strong instincts, but she was reactive where Harry was proactive, responding to where he went rather than anticipating where he was going, and the pattern of it was eventually predictable enough that when he spotted the snitch again near the center of the pitch he deliberately went the wrong direction first. She followed. He came back around in a long arc that cost time but cost her position, and took the snitch in a clean catch 8 feet above the pitch, closing his fist around it while the crowd, all of it, even the Slytherin section in the confused way that genuine excellence sometimes compelled acknowledgement from unwilling witnesses, made the sound that hundreds of people made when something happened that was too fast and too certain to process. Wood's yell was audible from the goalposts. Harry descended with the snitch still in his fist, gold wings beating against his palm, and landed with the easy balance of someone who'd been doing this for decades rather than 3 weeks, and the first thing he did was look at the staff section. Snape was already not looking at him. His attention had moved elsewhere with the deliberate pace of someone who did not want their attention to have been noticed. Quirrell's turban was slightly askew. After the celebrations, which were warm and genuine and which Harry allowed himself to be inside rather than managing from outside, Ron practically vibrating with joy, Angelina lifting him off his feet briefly in celebration which he hadn't anticipated, even Neville running down from the stands with the ceramic frog raised in triumph as if it had personally contributed. After all of that, Harry waited. He waited until Wood had led most of the team back to the changing rooms and the pitch was emptying and Ron and Hermione were talking to the Weasley twins near the stands. Then he walked to where Snape was still in the staff seating, now the only person remaining, ostensibly collecting something from beneath his seat. "Professor," Harry said. Snape straightened and turned. If he was surprised, he didn't show it, which meant either he wasn't or he was very good. Probably both. "Potter. Congratulations. Go celebrate with your teammates." "You were counterjinxing my broom," Harry said. Snape was quiet for a moment. "Was I?" The enchantment came from Quirrell. "You held it." "I could feel both." Harry held his gaze steadily. "So, thank you." Something moved across Snape's expression and was gone before Harry could fully categorize it. "You felt both enchantments?" "Yes." "From the air?" "While flying competitively?" "Yes." Snape looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone revising a document that already had several revisions on it. "What you're describing is a level of ambient magical sensitivity that," he stopped. "You shouldn't be able to distinguish between two simultaneous active enchantments at that range while engaged in complex physical activity." "Apparently I can," Harry said. "I wanted you to know I know." "And that he thought about how to say it. I know you're not straightforward about any of this. But on the specific thing of tonight, and the corridor, and the third floor, I think we're on the same side of it." Snape looked at him for a long time. The wind moved across the empty pitch. In the distance, the castle stood against the November sky with its towers and its warmth and its very long memory. "Go to your common room, Potter," Snape said. Not unkindly. Not warmly. Precisely. Harry went. He found Ron and Hermione waiting for him at the edge of the pitch, having clearly seen him talking to Snape and having clearly decided to wait rather than interrupt. Ron's expression said "What was that about?" and Hermione's expression said "I have hypotheses." Harry gave them both the short version as they walked back to the castle, and Hermione's hypotheses turned out to be mostly correct, which pleased her. "So Snape's actively working against Quirrell," Ron said. "On this specific thing. Don't extrapolate." "Right." He thought about it. "Does Dumbledore know Snape's doing that?" "Probably," Harry said. "Dumbledore tends to know things and not mention knowing them." "Does Dumbledore know Quirrell's getting worse?" Hermione said. "The jinx tonight, that's a significant escalation. He's moved from probing the protections to actively trying to eliminate obstacles." "I'm an obstacle," Harry said. "You are," she agreed. "Which means the timeline has compressed. He's not going to map all 7 protections carefully anymore. He's going to start moving through them." She looked at Harry. "We need to go down there before he does." Harry looked at her. You think we should go now? I think we should go soon. This week. She said it with the steady certainty she had when she'd been thinking about something for long enough that the thinking had become decision. If Voldemort gets through to the stone, he won't, Harry said. Not as bravado. As information. She held his gaze. How certain are you? Certain enough. He looked at the castle. But you're right about the timeline. We need to understand all 7 layers and we need to be ready to move quickly. He paused. What do we still not know? She pulled out the list she'd been maintaining, because of course she'd been maintaining a list. We know Fluffy, music to get past, which you're working on. We know Devil's Snare, light and warmth, simple enough. We know Flitwick's lair is almost certainly an enchanted key scenario, flying keys, which given you. She gestured at the Quidditch broom he was still carrying. Not our problem. Sprouts is the Devil's Snare. McGonagall's, chessmen, Harry said. She stopped. How do you know? I walked past her classroom 2 nights ago at about 11 and she was setting up a chess scenario that was too complicated to be for a class. He looked at Ron. That's yours. Ron went very still in the specific way he went still when he realized something was being asked of him that was important. Wizard chess. You're the best player I've met. Better than any of the older students I've seen play. Harry held his gaze. Are you all right with that? Ron was quiet for a moment. Then, yeah, he said. Yeah, I'm all right with that. He said it simply, and Harry believed him. 2 more layers, Hermione continued, looking at her list with the slight frown of incomplete information. One of which I believe is Snape's, a logical puzzle. Probably potions-based, given his specialty. She paused. And one I haven't identified. Dumbledore's, Harry said. She looked at him. The final layer, he said. Dumbledore told me in our second meeting that the final protection was something he considered unbeatable. He didn't describe it. He thought about the Tuesday meetings, they'd had 4 now, each one more honest than the last, the incremental honesty of someone learning to give it without the careful management they'd trained into it. But he said something else. He said the protection worked by showing a person something they could use but couldn't take for themselves. Hermione went very still. The Mirror of Erist. The Mirror of Erist, Harry agreed. He put the stone inside it. You can only retrieve it from the mirror if you want to find it but not use it. Because anyone who looked and wanted the stone for themselves would only see themselves using it, she said, rapidly. Not where it actually was. Brilliant. Yeah, Harry said. It is. He looked at the castle. And I can get it out. Because I genuinely don't want to use it. I just want no one else to have it. The 3 of them stood at the edge of the pitch in the cold clear November air and held the shape of what they were going to do, and none of them said anything for a moment because some things deserved a moment. When? Ron said. Not tonight, Harry said. But soon. He looked at Hermione. What do you need to be ready? I'm ready, she said. He believed that too. The week moved fast. Harry took his ambient work with Flitwick to a new level, specifically focused on producing sustained sound, not speech, but tone, a held musical note generated through the same mechanism as everything else he did without a wand, the pure expression of intention without physical tool. It was harder than most things he'd tried, not technically but personally, because singing was an inherently exposed act and he hadn't had enough years of not being exposed to find it natural. Flitwick didn't tell him to push through it. He gave Harry a theoretical framework. The resonance of ambient magic and sound worked on the same principles as wand resonance with verbal incantation, the physical vibration amplified and deepened by the magical intent behind it, and let Harry find his own way to the application. He found it on Thursday evening in the empty Charms classroom, on his own, when no one was watching. He opened his mouth and let sound come from the same place that moved things, that held trolls and lit rooms and navigated Quidditch pitches, and what came out was nothing like singing in the conventional sense but was also exactly that, a held tone that filled the classroom with warmth and resonance, that made the enchanted lanterns above burn higher for 3 seconds without him directing anything toward them, that moved through the stone walls in the way he could feel the castle's magic. Move through them. He held it for 10 seconds. He thought, that'll do for a 3-headed dog. Friday morning was Quirrell's last defense against the dark arts class before the weekend, and the lesson had an edge to it. Quirrell at the front of the classroom with his stammer more inconsistent than ever, the thing behind it surfacing and submerging in a rhythm that Harry found increasingly difficult to ignore. The lesson was on defensive theory, counter-jinxes, basic warding principles, and Quirrell taught it with the specific quality of someone performing a role that was simultaneously too small for them and too large. Halfway through, Quirrell dropped his wand. He reached for it, and the motion was wrong. The hand that reached was Quirrell's hand doing something that Quirrell's hand didn't normally do, a quality of control that was too precise, too efficient, the wand retrieved and replaced with a mechanical certainty that was nothing like Quirrell's usual fumbling. Everyone in the class saw it. Most of them processed it as nerves and moved on. Harry filed it as, tonight. He passed a note to Hermione under the desk. She read it, looked at him, looked at Quirrell, looked back at Harry, and gave a small, single nod. He passed one to Ron. Ron read it and his ears went red and he put the note in his pocket and didn't respond, which was his version of, understood. They went to dinner. They ate. Harry ate well. He'd learned that physical preparation was the unglamorous prerequisite of everything else, and Ron ate well and Hermione ate well despite having spent the walk from defense to the Great Hall reorganizing her mental preparation in real time. They talked about nothing in particular, and the nothing in particular had the quality of people giving themselves the gift of one normal meal before something that wouldn't be normal. At 8:30, Quirrell left the Great Hall. Harry watched him go. Across the room, Snape also watched him go, with dark eyes and the stillness of someone who had been waiting. Now. Ron said quietly, not looking up from his plate. Give him 20 minutes, Harry said. Let him get to the corridor and start through. We don't want to be right behind him, we want to be behind him by one layer. Hermione looked at him. If he gets through Quirrell's layer, he designed his own layer to let himself through. He won't be stopped by it. He kept his voice even. The troll's been removed by the Ministry since Halloween. Next is the snitch, which is flying keys, which won't stop him. Then Devil's Snare. Then McGonagall's chess. Then, he paused. Then Snape's, Hermione said. Then Snape's. Which I think will stop him. The logic puzzle. He met her eyes. You know logic. I think that one's yours if we catch up. She squared her shoulders in the way she squared them when she'd accepted a responsibility. Yes. Right. Harry looked at Ron. McGonagall's chess. I know, Ron said. He met Harry's eyes with a steadiness that was entirely Ron beneath the jokes. I know what it means. It's fine. At 8:53, the three of them got up from the Gryffindor table in a way that was casual enough to not draw attention, walked to the doors, and were gone. The castle accommodated them immediately. The staircase to the third floor was where it needed to be and shorter than it usually was, the corridors empty of people in a way that felt assisted. Harry felt the stones around him with the warm, attentive quality of something that was aware this mattered and was doing what it could. The door to the corridor was already standing open. Not forced open, standing open in the way a door stood when whatever it was keeping in had already gone out. Beyond it, the trapdoor in the floor was shut but the three-headed dog was. Harry looked at it. Fluffy was there, all three heads, but all three were asleep, and beneath the nearest enormous paw was a small, crushed mouth organ, the kind you could buy in a Muggle music shop for £2. Quirrell had gotten through. He played a mouth organ to himself, Ron said, looking at the crushed instrument. That's actually impressive, in a terrible way. Down, Harry said. They went through the trapdoor. The darkness below was absolute for approximately 1 second, and then Harry produced light, not with his wand, with himself, a warm ambient glow that filled the shaft without any gesture or incantation, and Hermione made a brief, involuntary sound that she immediately controlled. The devil's snare was below. It reached for all three of them with the enthusiastic certainty of something that had been waiting, and Harry brought the warmth up, not fire, not light, something between them, the heat signature of intent rather than the light signature of spell, and the snare recoiled. All of it, the whole enormous network of it, contracting away from Harry specifically with the speed of something that had touched something very hot. It released Ron and Hermione in the process. Hermione said, steadying herself on the far ledge. You just made the entire plant move, Harry said. Yes. Are you all right? I'm fine. She was already looking ahead. The keys. The key chamber was enormous and brilliant, winged silver keys filling it like a living cloud, and somewhere among them was the one that opened the door ahead. Harry looked at it for about 2 seconds and then rose without a broom, which was something he'd been careful not to do in front of people, not because he was hiding it but because there were contexts in which it was simply efficient and contexts in which it was showing off, and he was trying to learn the difference, and moved through the cloud of keys with the same ease he moved through Quidditch air. He felt the right key the way he felt everything now, clearly. He had it in 10 seconds. The door opened. The chess room was vast and cold and the pieces were already positioned as if they'd been there for centuries waiting for exactly this, which they essentially had. Harry looked at Ron. Ron looked at the board. His expression had gone to the one Harry had come to understand as Ron's working face, the one beneath the deflection, the real attention, the quality of mind that most people missed because it didn't announce itself. He looked at the board for 30 seconds without speaking. White to win, he said, almost to himself. He went through he took the black pieces side. Smart. They'd let him through without a fight if he's controlling them. He walked slowly along the edge of the board. Which means we have to beat the position he's left white in. Can we? Hermione said. I need to be the knight, Ron said. He said it simply, with no drama and no complaint. And you two need to get off the board before move 11. I'll win it in 13 moves, but the knight gets taken on move 11. Ron, Hermione started. It's chess, Hermione. Not actual, the pieces don't actually, they'll knock me off. I'll be sore. He looked at her steadily. And then you two go through while I'm down, and you get the stone, and it's fine. He looked at Harry. Go. Harry held his gaze for a moment. You're sure? I'm the best chess player in the school, Ron said. This is what I'm for. He said it with a very specific and very Ron kind of dignity, not grandiose, not self-sacrificing in the theatrical sense, just accurate. This was what he could do, and he was going to do it, and Harry loving him for it was welcome but not required. Get on the board, both of you, and get off by move 8. They won in 13 moves. Move 11 was the knight. Hermione made a sound when it happened, controlled immediately, professional immediately, and Harry stood at the edge of the board and watched Ron hit the stone floor and stayed with what he felt about that for exactly the time it took him to confirm Ron was breathing and conscious and had the blurry, annoyed expression of someone who'd taken a hard hit and was going to be very sore but was intact. I'm fine, Ron said, from the floor. Go. Harry went. The door beyond the chess room opened to Snape's chamber, which was a line of 7 bottles arranged along a table with a parchment of clues and a wall of purple flame behind them and black flame ahead. The logic puzzle was exactly what Hermione had predicted, precise, cold, the kind of problem that had one answer if you applied reason correctly and killed you if you didn't. She had it in 4 minutes. That one, she said, pointing to the smallest bottle. It'll get you through the black flame. The round bottle on the left gets you back through the purple. She looked at Harry. There's only enough in the small one for one person. Then you take the round one, he said. Go back to Ron. Get both of you up to the school and to Dumbledore. He's going to be needed for whatever comes after. She looked at him. The look had several things in it and she didn't try to reduce it to fewer. Be careful. I'll be fine. I know you will. She held his gaze. That's actually not what I meant by careful. She paused. Don't let him make you into something you're not. Either of them. He looked at her for a moment. Either of, Voldemort will try to offer you something. And Dumbledore will try to frame what you do tonight in a particular way, afterward. Her voice was steady and entirely serious. You're Harry Potter. Not a weapon and not a symbol. Keep knowing that while you're in there. He looked at her for a long moment. You're very occasionally terrifying. I prefer thorough, she said, and handed him the small bottle, and went back through the purple flame. Harry drank the potion. It was cold and tasted of clarity, which was probably a coincidence but felt like intention. He walked through the black flame and was through it, and the room beyond, was the mirror. Quirrell was standing in front of it. He'd heard Harry come through, turned immediately, his expression already arranged for a confrontation, his stammer gone entirely in the way it was gone when Quirrell wasn't driving. His voice, when he spoke, had a double quality, a harmony of a voice beneath a voice. Harry Potter, Quirrell said. Or rather, the other one wanted to greet you. But we haven't the time for theater. Where is he? Harry said. He was looking at the mirror, at the stone inside it, at the reflection of himself standing in the chamber. Not you. The other one. Quirrell tilted his head. You're asking for Voldemort. I'm asking where Voldemort actually is, Harry said, because I've been watching you come apart for 2 months and I'd like to know how much of what's in front of me is you and how much is him, because it affects how I respond. Quirrell was quiet for a moment. The double quality in his voice shifted. What was underneath came up. More of me than him, now, said the voice that was not Quirrell's. He's almost used me up. Which I imagine is useful information. A pause. Look at the mirror, Harry. Harry looked at the mirror. He saw himself, the same clear version he'd seen before, with his parents around him and the castle burning bright. And in his reflection's hand, exactly where the unidentifiable thing had been the first time he looked, was the stone. Small and red and absolutely specific in the way of things that were completely what they were. He felt it appear in his actual pocket. The mirror had given it to him. Because he wanted to find it and protect it, and that was genuinely all. You have it, said Voldemort's voice, through Quirrell. It was not a question. Yes, Harry said. Give it to me. No. The word was simple and absolute, and it sat in the chamber without drama, which was the most dramatic thing about it. Quirrell's face did something that was not Quirrell reacting, it was something older and colder and infinitely more frustrated. You understand what I am, Voldemort said. What I was. What I will be again, with or without that stone. Probably, Harry said. But not with it. Not tonight. I can offer you, I know what you're going to offer me. Harry looked at Quirrell's face, at the thing behind it, at the red quality he'd seen through Quirrell's eyes at Halloween, the ancient shrunken fury of something that had been enormous and was now barely held together. You're going to offer me my parents. You can't give me my parents. You can offer me information about them, which I'd frankly prefer to just find in a library. A pause. Power, then. I have power. Not like mine. Different to yours, Harry said. Which I actually prefer. He held the red gaze behind Quirrell's eyes. You're not going to get the stone tonight. You're not going to get it by offering me things, and you're not going to get it by force because you're currently occupying someone who's mostly used up and whose structural integrity is not great, and I know enough about what you are right now to know that you can't sustain a direct magical confrontation. Quirrell's wand came up. Harry didn't reach for his own. What happened was this, Quirrell cast, and the spell, a sharp, cutting thing, crossed the 8 feet between them in the time it would have taken Harry to raise his wand, and Harry caught it the same way he'd caught the Trolls Club, with the ambient field that existed around him the way warmth exists around a fire, not because he directed it there but because it was simply what he was. The spell stopped. Reversed. Not redirected toward Quirrell, Harry actively declined that. He had no interest in doing to Quirrell what Quirrell had been trying to do to him, just dissipated. Unmade in the air between them. Quirrell stared. Then he screamed. Not Quirrell's scream, the thing using Quirrell's voice to make a sound that was not pain exactly but was the response to contact with something profoundly antithetical. Harry was close enough now to have put out his hand, close enough to have touched Quirrell's arm, and the ambient heat of what he was radiated outward without his controlling it, and what it touched, every place the ambient heat touched Quirrell, the flesh blistered. Not fire blistering. Something else. The magical incompatibility of a diminished dark thing pressed against something that was simply too vital, too fully alive and present and unrestricted. Harry stepped back. He didn't step back because he was afraid. He stepped back because doing damage to Quirrell, whatever Quirrell was now, however much of him remained, was not something he was going to do more of than what had already happened. "You're killing him," Harry said, to the thing inside. Voldemort said nothing. "You've been killing him all year. Using him until there's nothing left." He stood in the chamber with the stone in his pocket and the mirror at his back and the burned, deteriorating shape of Quirrell in front of him. "The person you're inside is dying because of you." "Sentiment," Voldemort said. But the word was strained. "Observation," Harry said. "I'm not asking you to feel bad about it. I'm pointing out that you're running out of body and you're not getting the stone, and the next time we meet you're going to have had to find another host, and that pattern is going to keep happening." He held the red gaze directly. "Because I'm going to be here. Every time. And I'm not," he thought about how to say it precisely. "I'm not afraid of you. I know you know that. I know you felt it. I want you to understand it's not bravado. It's just, I've looked at you. Clearly. And what I see doesn't frighten me." Something happened to Quirrell's face that was not Quirrell's expression. Something that, in another context and another face, might have been the beginning of something that had not been felt in a very long time. It was gone in a second. The scream that followed was enormous and white and came from everywhere at once, not from Quirrell's body but from the thing leaving it, the form that rose and shook the chamber air and was for one moment visible as what it actually was, diminished, small, ancient, furious, and profoundly alone. It rushed at Harry. He felt it pass through him. It was cold in the specific way of something that was the opposite of life, not dead, exactly, not peaceful, but the absolute negation of warmth and presence, and it passed through Harry the way cold air passes through an open window on a summer day, present and then gone, unable to find purchase in something that was burning too warmly to be occupied. Quirrell crumpled. Harry caught him. Not out of instinct, deliberately, a specific choice, crossing the space quickly and getting his arms under Quirrell as he went down, lowering him to the stone floor with a care that he gave because Quirrell was a person who had been used and used up and was entitled, at the end of it, to be caught. Quirrell was unconscious and his breathing was the slow, irregular breathing of someone at the far edge, and his face without the thing behind it was younger than Harry had thought, surprised and hollowed. Harry sat on the floor of the chamber with Quirrell's head in his lap and the stone in his pocket and the mirror of Eriste behind him showing, when he glanced at it, the same image it had always shown, himself, standing normally, people around him. He held the stone in his hand and looked at it. Red, small, warm. The thing that could make gold and cure death and had been sitting in a mirror in a school basement being fought over by a diminished dark wizard and an 11-year-old boy. He put it back in his pocket. He put his hand on Quirrell's shoulder, not to do anything, not to help in any physical way, just because the man was alone and dying in a basement and someone should be there, and waited for the warmth to arrive, which it did, approximately 4 minutes later, in a burst of amber light and the sound of wings. Fawkes landed on the stone floor beside him without drama and looked at Quirrell and then at Harry with those volcanic, patient eyes. "I know," Harry said. "I know it was too late for him." He looked down at Quirrell. Could you, is there anything? Fawkes made the sound that meant no, but gently. Okay, Harry said. The phoenix sat with him on the floor of the chamber while Quirrell's breathing grew quieter and then stopped, and Harry sat very still with his hand on Quirrell's shoulder and felt the stone in his pocket and felt the castle around him, warm and attentive and holding. He was not crying. He was not cold. He was not afraid. He was simply present, which was the most he could offer the moment, and he gave it completely. When Fawkes finally rose, his song filled the chamber like water filling a vessel, not the shattering note of the sorting, not the complex phoenix song in full throat, but something quieter and more personal, the song you'd sing at the end of something, the kind of music that didn't try to make things better but simply acknowledged that they were. Harry got to his feet. He looked at Quirrell. At the mirror. At the black flame behind him and the door beyond it. He put his hand in his pocket and closed it around the stone and made a decision, not the dramatic decision of a hero at the climax of a story, but the practical one of a person who has just done something difficult and has to figure out what comes next. He walked back through the black flame. Fawkes flew beside him.